What would you do if you watched a man drag home a rusted, rotting pile of junk, and then found out that pile of junk was worth $5 million? The neighbors laughed. The kids pointed. Even the garbage men slowed down to stare. But Adrian Calloway didn't flinch, not once, because the man crouching in that driveway, covered in grease, wearing a flannel shirt with a busted button, that man was a billionaire. And he had just found something the entire world had been searching for 40 years. This is his story, and I promise you, you will not see the ending coming. If you're watching this right now, drop a comment telling me what city you're from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Hit that like button and stay with me until the very last second. Let's go. The neighborhood of Sycamore Drive in Beaumont, Texas, was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody's business, except when they didn't. And when they didn't, they made something up. It was a modest stretch of houses, the kind built sometime in the late 80s with good intentions and thin walls. The lawns were mostly maintained. The driveways held the usual mix of minivans and pickup trucks. On Friday nights in summer, you could smell 3 or 4 different barbecue setups running simultaneously, and somebody's kid was always bouncing a basketball at the wrong hour. It was, in the most honest terms possible, an ordinary street, which made Adrian Calloway all the more out of place, though almost nobody on Sycamore Drive understood that yet. He had moved in 18 months ago, quiet and unremarkable, paid cash for the house, which the real estate agent found slightly unusual but not enough to comment on. He drove a 2009 Ford F250 with a cracked passenger mirror that he had been meaning to fix for 6 months. He waved when neighbors waved, returned borrowed tools, kept his grass cut. His son Mason, 7 years old with his mother's dark eyes and his father's stubborn chin, rode his bike up and down the sidewalk most afternoons, sometimes alone, sometimes with the Nguyen kids from 3 houses down. Nobody asked too many questions about Adrian. He had that quality, the kind of stillness that discourages interrogation. He wasn't cold, exactly. He would stop and talk about the weather or the Texans' latest disaster of a season. But there was always something sealed behind his eyes, a private room that he didn't open for visitors. And most people on Sycamore Drive had learned without being told that the room wasn't available for tours. What they did know, mostly through Darlene Hutchins at number 14, who made it her personal mission to know everything, was that his wife had died 2 years back. Cancer, someone said. Car accident, someone else said. Darlene herself claimed it was something sudden and terrible, and left it at that with the satisfied expression of a woman who knew more than she was sharing. What nobody on Sycamore Drive knew, what nobody in the greater Beaumont metropolitan area knew, for that matter, was that Adrian James Calloway had been listed in Forbes 3 years running. That the private consulting work he did from his garage was actually the quiet management of a tech infrastructure company he had built from a rented storage unit at age 24. That the worn flannel shirts and the cracked mirror were not signs of financial struggle, but of a man who had deliberately stepped away from a world that demanded he perform a version of himself he no longer wanted to be. He wasn't hiding, exactly. He had just stopped raising his hand. The garage behind his house was the one place where the sealed room opened slightly. It was large, larger than it looked from the street, and meticulously organized in a way that suggested a specific kind of mind. Tools hung on pegboards with painted outlines marking exactly where each one belonged. A hydraulic lift sat in the center. One wall held a long workbench covered in the controlled chaos of active projects, carburetor parts, timing equipment, coils of wire sorted by gauge. A small space heater hummed in the corner during cold months. There was a folding chair near the garage door that had somehow accumulated a permanent cup holder, a dog-eared copy of a 1974 automotive engineering textbook, and Mason's half-finished drawings of race cars that bore no resemblance to any vehicle that had ever existed. That garage was where Adrian Calloway went to think, and in the 18 months since arriving on Sycamore Drive, he had done a considerable amount of thinking there. It was a Saturday in late October when everything changed, though none of the neighbors recognized it at the time. The morning had started like most Saturdays. Mason had woken up at 6:15 demanding pancakes, which Adrian made badly as always. Slightly burned on one side, slightly underdone on the other, and Mason ate them without complaint because he had inherited his father's ability to accept imperfection with dignity. They ate together at the kitchen table with the television off, which was their rule on weekend mornings. Mason drew another impossible race car while Adrian drank his coffee and read something on his phone with a frown that had nothing to do with the coffee. By 9 o'clock, Adrian had loaded Mason into the truck with a promise of a stop at Whataburger on the way home, and they drove 40 minutes east to the Beaumont Municipal Salvage Yard on Route 90. The salvage yard was the kind of place that had a smell before it had a shape. Rust and oil and old rubber, and something underneath those, something organic and difficult to name. It sprawled across 6 acres behind a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire that had gone sideways in sections. A hand-painted sign at the entrance read, "Bertram's Auto Salvage, cash only, no exceptions." And below that, in smaller letters that someone had added later, "Seriously, no exceptions." Old Bertram himself, who was not actually named Bertram but had inherited both the business and the nickname from his uncle, sat in a lawn chair just inside the gate with a thermos of something that was probably not coffee. He was 71 years old, built like a man who had spent a lifetime lifting things, and he had the specific wariness of someone who had been talked into too many bad deals over too many decades. "Calloway," he said, when Adrian and Mason walked through the gate. "Bertram." Adrian nodded. "What's new in the back 40? Bertram scratched his jaw. "Got a delivery Thursday. Some stuff out of an estate auction up near Houston. Didn't go through it all yet." He looked at Mason. "You keep your hands visible, boy. There's sharp things back there." "Yes, sir," Mason said seriously, and held both hands out in front of him like a surgeon preparing to operate, which made Bertram almost smile. They walked the yard for an hour. This was something Adrian did with a kind of quiet patience that Mason had learned to mirror, moving slowly through the rows of stripped vehicles and stacked parts, eyes moving methodically, touching things occasionally, rarely speaking. Mason had developed his own system for these walks, which involved categorizing everything he saw by color and assigning it a points value that made sense only to him. He kept a running tally in his head and would announce the final score on the drive home. Adrian almost missed it. It was shoved against the back fence, partially hidden behind the collapsed shell of a mid-90s Chevy pickup. You could see maybe a third of it from the main path, and what you could see was discouraging. A crushed front quarter panel, no hood, what appeared to be severe frame damage along the driver's side. The windshield was gone. The interior was gutted down to bare metal. The paint, whatever color it had once been, was buried under a uniform coat of rust so complete it looked almost deliberate. Adrian stopped. He stood there for a moment, not moving. In that way he had that Mason privately thought of as Dad going somewhere in his brain. Then he crouched down. He moved the Chevy carcass aside. It was lighter than it looked, mostly shell, and got low, examining the underside of the wreck. His hand moved along the frame rail slowly, the way a person runs a finger along a line of text they're reading carefully. He tilted his head. He stood up, walked around to the other side, crouched again. "Dad," Mason said, "what is it?" "Don't know yet," Adrian said, which was his standard answer when he did know but wasn't ready to say. He spent another 12 minutes examining the car without speaking. Mason found a piece of twisted chrome and added it to his point system. The morning got warmer. Somewhere in the middle of the salvage yard, a crow was making complaints about something. Finally, Adrian stood up and dusted his hands on his jeans. "Go find Bertram," he said. The negotiation took less time than you'd expect. Bertram walked back with Mason and looked at the wreck with the expression of a man being shown a particularly disappointing casserole. "That came in with the Houston estate lot," he said. "Whoever owned it, they didn't know what they had, and what they had was a pile of junk." "What do you want for it?" Adrian asked. Bertram looked at him with the calculation of a man who had been selling things for 50 years. "You see something in it." "I see a project," Adrian said, which was technically true. "I was going to crush it end of the month. Nothing usable." Bertram kicked one of the flattened tires without enthusiasm. "Tell you what, $100, you haul it off today. Saves me the trouble." Adrian paid in cash, which he always had, and arranged for a flatbed out of town to deliver it to Sycamore Drive that afternoon. On the drive home, Mason ate his Whataburger and announced that Saturday's salvage yard score was 412 points, which was a personal record. Adrian drove and didn't say much, but he was doing something with his left hand that Mason recognized, tapping a specific rhythm against his thigh, 3 beats and a pause. 3 beats and a pause. It was the thing he did when he was working something out. Mason didn't ask about it. He'd learned that some things needed to be worked out in silence first. The flatbed arrived at 2:30 that afternoon. By 2:45, Sycamore Drive had an audience. It started with Dale Hutchins, who was washing his car in the driveway at number 14 and stopped with the hose still running when the flatbed rolled past. His wife Darlene appeared from the front door 30 seconds later with the specific radar of a person who operates a neighborhood information network. By 3 o'clock, there were 6 people standing on the sidewalk across from Adrian's house, and by 3:15 there were 11, including Roger Pressman from the corner who had driven back from Home Depot specifically because Darlene had called him. The car, lowered by the flatbed onto Adrian's driveway, looked even worse in full daylight and in relation to normal human beings who could stand next to it for scale. It was a small vehicle, compact, low to the ground, though the exact original dimensions were hard to determine given the damage. The body was crumpled at multiple points. The rust was comprehensive. There was a section of the roof that had partially collapsed. One of the rear wheel wells was so deformed it looked like the car had been angry about something and tried to fold itself in half. "Lord have mercy," Darlene said. "He paid to have that delivered?" Roger said. $100, I heard, said Dale, though he hadn't heard this from any reliable source. "You can't even tell what it is," said Keisha Washington from number 9, who had joined the group with her twins in a double stroller. "Is that a car?" "It was," Roger said. "Once, probably." From across the street, Adrian directed the flatbed driver with hand signals, got the car positioned correctly on his driveway, signed some paperwork, and thanked the driver with a handshake. Then he stood in front of the wreck with his hands on his hips and looked at it for a while. He must have felt his audience because he glanced across the street. He didn't seem bothered by the collection of neighbors. He gave a small, unremarkable wave, the kind of wave that says, "Yeah, I see you," rather than "hello," and then turned back to the car. "He's going to restore that?" Darlene said. "He'd be better off burning it," Roger said. "Maybe he paid $100 too much," Dale said, and several people laughed. Mason appeared from the side of the house, still holding what was left of his Whataburger wrapper, and stood beside his father looking at the car with the same expression his father wore. Not enthusiasm, exactly, but a kind of serious engagement, a willingness to contend with the thing in front of him. "What do we do first?" Mason asked. "Clean it up," Adrian said. "You don't know what you're dealing with until you can see it." Mason nodded like this was perfectly reasonable advice about anything. Across the street, Darlene was already composing the next-door post in her head. Evelyn Pierce had been working the 6 to 2 shift at Ronnie's Diner on Magnolia Avenue for 3 years, which meant she had served approximately 47,000 cups of coffee to people she'd mostly never see again, endured 2 managers who couldn't organize a grocery list, survived a kitchen fire that had been significantly more dramatic than the local news reported, and saved slightly less money than she needed to feel like she was getting somewhere. She was 30 years old, which she was mostly fine with, though some mornings it surprised her. She had her mother's practicality and her father's stubbornness, which was a combination that served her better than she gave it credit for. Her apartment on Sycamore Drive, she rented the small upstairs unit at number 7, was clean and sparse in the way of someone who has learned not to accumulate things they might have to move quickly. She owned exactly what she used and used most of what she owned. She had noticed Adrian Calloway the way you notice someone who exists at the edge of your peripheral vision, not with great interest, but with the background awareness of a person trying to understand their environment. She knew he was quiet. She knew he had a kid. She knew he worked in his garage at odd hours because she could see the light from her bedroom window on nights when she was up late, which was often. She had not introduced herself in 18 months, which she was privately embarrassed about, but had been too busy surviving to address. The Saturday the car arrived, she was walking home from a late shift. The 2 o'clock had stretched to 5 because Carla had called in sick, and Ronnie's scheduling was always a fiction. And she came down Sycamore Drive to find the usual Saturday evening version of the street, which was quiet in the specific way of a place that had been noisier earlier. She could see the remains of the neighborhood audience, mostly dispersed now. A few people still lingering near the Hutchins driveway talking. She almost walked past. Then she saw the car. It was sitting in Adrian's driveway, under a work light he'd set up on a stand, and Adrian was crouching next to it doing something with a wire brush, and the light hit the rusted body in a way that made it look almost architectural, all these layers of damage and time made visible. She stopped on the sidewalk without quite meaning to. She'd worked around enough machinery at various jobs not to be completely ignorant about cars. Her father had restored a '68 Mustang over the course of her entire childhood, which meant she'd grown up watching someone love something back into existence, piece by piece, with more patience than money. She knew enough to know that whatever Adrian was looking at under that work light, it wasn't what most people saw when they looked at the wreck. The way he moved around it, deliberate, unhurried, touching specific points with specific intention, reminded her of the way her father used to crouch next to that Mustang on Sunday mornings with his coffee going cold beside him. Like the car was telling him something and he was listening. She stood there longer than she meant to, long enough that he looked up. "Sorry," she said immediately, which was a reflex. I just live up there." She pointed at number 7. He looked where she pointed, then back at her. "I know. I've seen you." She wasn't sure what to say to that. "I'm Adrian," he said, and stood up, which meant he was taller than she'd realized. He didn't offer his hand because his hands were covered in rust-colored dust. He gestured at them as explanation. "Evelyn? Evelyn Pierce." He nodded. Then he looked back at the car, which she understood to be not rudeness, but simply the thing pulling his attention. "What is it?" she asked. "I mean, what was it?" He paused before answering, which she would come to understand was how he handled questions he was thinking carefully about. "Don't know exactly yet." "Why did you buy it?" Another pause. "Because nobody else saw it." She looked at the wreck, the crushed panels, the collapsed roof section, the comprehensive rust, the general appearance of something that had given up. And she looked at Adrian, who was looking at the same thing she was looking at, but clearly seeing something different. "I'll let you get to it," she said. "Okay," he said, already back to crouching. She walked up to her apartment, made herself dinner, and sat at her kitchen table with her window open because the October air was finally doing what October air was supposed to do. From 3 houses down, she could see the work light still burning. She thought about what he'd said, because nobody else saw it. It was a strange thing to say about $100 wreck, but something about the certainty in his voice made it feel less strange than it should have. Adrian worked every night that first week. After Mason was in bed, he would go to the garage or out to the driveway and work until midnight, or 1, sometimes later. He had the discipline of someone who could function on 5 hours of sleep indefinitely, which he'd built out of necessity during the early years of his company when there had been no alternative to functioning on 5 hours of sleep indefinitely. The first task was cleaning. Not restoring, just seeing. He removed decades of accumulated grime with solvents and wire brushes and a pressure washer borrowed from the Nguyen family, working layer by layer the way an archaeologist uncovers something fragile and potentially significant. Mason helped on Sunday afternoon with the water hose and a sponge and an enthusiasm for the work that was more chaotic than useful, but which Adrian accommodated with patience. What emerged beneath the rust, slowly, section by section, was surprising. Not the body, which remained badly damaged and would need extensive work regardless, but the architecture underneath. The frame rails, where accessible, showed geometry that was not standard. The suspension pickup points were in positions Adrian had to measure twice because he wasn't certain he was reading the rusted metal correctly. The rear subframe, cleaned to a point where he could actually examine it, revealed fabrication work of exceptional precision, hand-built, clearly, not stamped from a factory die. He found the first marking on the 3rd night. It was stamped into the frame rail on the driver's side, partially obscured by a bracket that had been welded on at some point and then partially removed, leaving a ghost of itself. Adrian spent 40 minutes with a chemical rust treatment and a flashlight before the numbers and letters were clear enough to read. He sat back on his heels in the driveway and looked at what he'd uncovered for a long time. Then he went inside and opened his laptop. He was still at the laptop at 3 in the morning, with 4 browser tabs open and the remains of a cup of coffee gone cold at his elbow, and the expression on his face was the one he wore when he was trying very hard not to jump to a conclusion he couldn't yet support. Evelyn brought coffee on Tuesday. She hadn't planned it. She'd made a full pot before her Wednesday morning shift and found herself with more than she needed and a reason to not stay in her apartment staring at her budget spreadsheet, which had stopped containing good news some weeks ago. She put some in a thermos, the red one, which was the only one she had, and walked down the street at 8:30 p.m. which she told herself was a perfectly normal thing to do and which she knew was not entirely about the coffee. The garage door was open. Adrian was underneath the car on a creeper, only his legs visible. Mason was sitting on the folding chair with a coloring book, working with the specific intensity of a 7-year-old who has decided that coloring is a professional endeavor. Evelyn stopped at the edge of the garage. "I made too much coffee," she said, which was the announcement she'd prepared. Mason looked up. "Dad drinks a lot of coffee," he reported helpfully. "He says it's a character flaw." From under the car, "It is a character flaw." "I've got a thermos," Evelyn said. Adrian slid out from under the car on the creeper. He was wearing a gray t-shirt with a stain on the shoulder that was probably not recent, and he had a smudge of something dark across one cheekbone. And he looked, she noticed, and then decided she hadn't noticed. Not bad for a man who had been lying on pavement. He sat up and looked at the thermos. "Red thermos," he said. "Only one I have." "What kind?" "Dark roast. From Ronnie's Diner. I work there. I have access." He accepted the thermos and poured some into the cup of a cup that was sitting on the garage floor and had the words "World's Okayest Mechanic" printed on the side. He drank. He nodded. "Good," he said. "I know," she said, because it was. She stayed for an hour. She sat on an overturned bucket near Mason's chair. Adrian produced the bucket from somewhere with the efficiency of a man who always knows where the extra bucket is, and she watched him work while Mason explained his coloring book to her in detail that suggested he had given the backstories of each character considerable thought. She found herself watching Adrian's hands more than anything else. The way they moved over the car was different from anything she'd seen before. Not confident in the showy sense, but certain. Like someone reading a language they've known their whole life. He didn't fumble. He didn't second guess. He moved from one thing to the next with an economy of motion that suggested a brain working significantly faster than the hands it was directing. "Can I ask what you're looking for?" she said, during a gap in Mason's narrative. He didn't answer immediately. She was starting to understand that his silences were not evasions. They were him deciding whether the thing he was about to say was actually what he meant to say. "I found some markings," he said, "on the frame. Serial numbers, basically, but not standard." He paused. This car was hand-built, which isn't unusual for a custom project, but the geometry is. There are things here that don't match anything in normal production. "What does that mean?" "I don't know yet," he said, and she believed him, and she also believed that "yet" was carrying significant weight in that sentence. Mason looked up from his coloring. "Dad thinks it's special." "Mason," Adrian said, which was a one-word sentence that meant, "Don't say things I haven't decided yet." "He does, though," Mason told Evelyn, undeterred. Evelyn looked at the car, the damaged, ugly, rust-eaten car sitting in the fluorescent wash of the garage lights, and tried to see what Adrian saw in it. She couldn't, quite, but she could see something in the way he looked at it, a focus that had nothing to do with $100 investments. She walked home at 9:30 with the empty thermos, and she was thinking about something her father had said once, standing over his Mustang with his hands on his hips on a cold Saturday morning. The thing about broken things is, most people stop looking at them, which means most people never see what's underneath. She hadn't thought about that in years. By Thursday, the novelty of the rusted wreck had converted, on Sycamore Drive, from a source of mockery into something more complicated. It had started with Dale Hutchins, who had nothing better to do on his day off, and wandered down the sidewalk Thursday morning with the pretense of checking his mailbox, which was in the opposite direction, and ended up standing in front of Adrian's driveway for 15 minutes. He couldn't see much. The car was inside the garage now, positioned on the lift, and the garage door was closed. But he could hear something. Metal. And a kind of deliberate quiet between the sounds that felt, somehow, significant. He mentioned it to Darlene. Darlene, who operated with the situational intelligence of a small field general, made 3 phone calls and a next-door post that was technically a question about neighborhood noise ordinances, but was actually a dispatch requesting reconnaissance. By Thursday evening, there was a pattern of foot traffic past number 12. People walking dogs, walking children, walking nothing. That was sufficiently unusual that even Mason noticed and mentioned it to his father. "Why do people keep going past?" Mason asked. "Curiosity," Adrian said. "About the car?" "Probably." Mason thought about this. Should we close the blinds? Adrian almost smiled. We don't have anything to hide, bud. This was not entirely accurate, as it turned out. What Adrian had been doing in the hours when he wasn't cleaning or examining was research. He had taken photographs of every marking, every stamped number, every piece of hand-fabricated geometry he could find, and he had sent them, carefully and without identifying context, to 3 people. One was a retired automotive engineer he'd met at a conference in Dallas 4 years earlier and trusted with a specific kind of technical judgment. One was a vintage racing historian based in Austin who maintained an archive of pre-1980 motorsport documentation that had no public counterpart. The third was a fabrication specialist in England who had spent 30 years identifying hand-built racing components for insurance purposes. He hadn't told any of them where the car was. He hadn't told them he owned it. He had sent photographs and asked questions in the detached, technical language of someone conducting theoretical research. All 3 had responded within 48 hours, which was unusual. The kind of unusual that happened when something made someone's hand move faster than their professional caution. The Austin historian, a woman named Deborah Shanks, who had once taken 6 months to return an email about a 1962 Le Mans entry list, responded in 4 hours with a message that was, for her, extremely agitated in tone. It contained 3 questions, 7 technical observations, and 1 sentence that Adrian read several times. If these photographs represent what I think they represent, you need to be extremely careful about who you tell. He sat with that for a while. Then he kept working. Friday night, Evelyn brought the red thermos again. She told herself she was being neighborly. This was mostly true and also mostly a simplification. The garage door was open. Adrian was at the workbench this time, not under the car, bent over something under a magnifying lamp with an intensity that made her pause at the threshold before saying anything. Mason was asleep. She could see the light was off in his bedroom window from the street, which meant it was past 9 and Adrian was alone with whatever he was looking at. "Coffee," she said softly, in case the intensity required quiet. He looked up. He'd been somewhere else. She could see the moment he came back. "Thanks," he said. "Come in." She poured for him into the world's okayest mechanic mug and poured some for herself into the thermos cap, which worked well enough. She looked at what was on the workbench. It was a panel, a small piece of bodywork, clean to bare metal, and under the magnifying lamp she could see markings she wouldn't have been able to read without it. "What are you looking at?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've been looking into the history of this car." "And?" "There are some things I'm not ready to say yet." She looked at him. "But you know something." "I think I know something," he said carefully. "I'm not certain." "What's the version where you're right?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "The version where I'm right is unusual." She waited. He put down the tool he was holding, a small brass implement she couldn't identify, and leaned back against the workbench and crossed his arms in the posture of a man deciding how much to say. "In 1973, he said, there was a racing team out of Chicago called Caldwell Rice Motorsports. They ran endurance races, long distance, that kind of thing. They had an engineer named Frank Welder who was—" He stopped. "Who was apparently exceptional, the kind of engineer who sees things other people don't. He was developing a car, a prototype, new suspension geometry, a kind of frame design that nobody had tried. The idea was to test it at a few smaller circuits before a major entry." Evelyn watched him. The car was never raced. The team folded in 1974. Money problems, the usual. The prototype was supposed to be sold at auction, but there was a fire at the team's storage facility. Everything was believed destroyed. The car, the blueprints, Frank Welder's technical documentation. He paused. Frank Welder disappeared after that. No one in the motorsport world could find him. He just stopped existing as far as public record goes. The garage was quiet. From somewhere outside, a dog was barking at something it had probably imagined. The prototype became a kind of legend, Adrian said. In vintage racing circles, anyway. The design ideas that Welder had documented, some of them showed up in other engineers' work years later, which means someone had seen the blueprints before the fire. But the car itself was considered gone. Evelyn looked at the rusted vehicle on the lift, at the crushed panels and the collapsed roof, and the comprehensive damage that had made an entire neighborhood laugh. "You think that's it?" she said. "I think there's a significant possibility," Adrian said, "based on the frame markings, based on the geometry, based on what 3 different people who don't know each other have said when they saw the photographs." He uncrossed his arms. "But I need more evidence before I say it out loud to anyone who matters." She was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup in her hands. "How much would it be worth?" she said. "If you're right." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "I'm not sure there's a number." She looked at him, at the grease-stained shirt and the tired eyes and the magnifying lamp and the small brass tool on the workbench. And she said, "And you're in here alone at 9:30 on a Friday night." "I'm usually in here alone at 9:30 on a Friday night," he said. "I know," she said. "I've seen the light." He looked at her, really looked, in a way he didn't often do with people. And there was something in his expression that she couldn't quite read. Not guarded, exactly. Something more complicated than guarded. "It's a good project," he said, which was not what he'd meant to say, and they both probably knew it. She stayed until 11. They talked, mostly, about other things. Mason's school, the diner, a conversation about the Beaumont weather, which was a reliable topic because the Beaumont weather was reliably terrible. Normal things. The kind of conversation that exists on the surface but carries something else underneath. The way the car's surface carried something underneath that nobody on Sycamore Drive could see. When she left, Adrian watched her walk up the street toward number 7, and then he turned back to the garage and looked at the rusted wreck on the lift for a long time. He thought about Frank Welder, a man who had built something extraordinary and watched it disappear. A man who had then disappeared himself. He thought about things that go missing, things that seem lost, things that are actually just waiting for the right person to stop walking past and actually look. He picked up the brass tool and went back to work. What nobody on Sycamore Drive knew about Adrian Calloway, what almost nobody anywhere knew, because he had taken considerable care to ensure this, was that the weight behind his eyes had a specific name. Her name had been Rachel. Rachel Calloway, née Bird, had died 26 months ago on a Tuesday, which was an ordinary day with no business being that kind of day. She had been 30 years old. She had been, and this was the thing that made the ordinary Tuesday so incomprehensible, healthy, as far as anyone had known. The aneurysm had given no warning and taken less than 12 hours. Adrian had been in a meeting in Austin when his phone rang. He had landed the company's largest contract that week. He remembered this with the helpless clarity of a man who cannot stop knowing it, that he had been shaking someone's hand in congratulation at approximately the same time. He had never fully decided what to do with this information. He had handled the aftermath the way he handled most problems, which was with tremendous competence and almost no discussion. The practical arrangements, the estate, Mason's school, the decision to sell the Austin house and find somewhere smaller and quieter, all of it executed with the efficiency of a man whose whole life had been the construction of systems that worked without requiring him to feel things at dangerous times. He was, he knew, not entirely okay. He was also, he knew, okay enough. There was a difference, and he was trying to live in it. Mason helped. Mason helped in the way that children help in these circumstances. Not by being comforting, which was not the job of a 7-year-old, but by being continuous. By needing breakfast and school and coloring books and impossible race car drawings and the presence of a father who showed up. The requirement of showing up was, it turned out, very useful to a man who might otherwise have stopped doing much else. The garage also helped. There was something about work that required all of you, physical and mental, both hands and the thinking brain, precision and patience, that made it impossible to be somewhere else at the same time. When Adrian was working, he was only working. The grief waited outside the garage door. It was always there when he came out, and he had accepted this, but for the hours he was inside, he got a break from it. The wreck was, in this sense, more than a project. He hadn't said this to anyone. He wasn't sure he could say it to anyone in a way that made sense from the outside. But on Friday nights in his garage with the work light burning and the neighborhood quiet and Mason asleep in the house, and a thermos of good coffee someone had thought to bring, on those nights, something that had been very tight in him for 2 years was slightly less tight. He didn't know what to do with that either. He went back to work. By Saturday morning, exactly 1 week after he dragged home the wreck that made the neighborhood laugh, Adrian Calloway had been awake for 31 of the last 36 hours. He was sitting on the garage floor, back against the wall, with his knees up and a cold cup of coffee beside him and his laptop open on his thighs. The email he'd just received was 4 paragraphs long. It was from Deborah Shanks in Austin, and its tone had moved beyond agitated into something that he could only describe as carefully controlled alarm. She had found documentation. Archive materials from a Chicago Racing Federation, partially digitized in 2019, that included a partial build log for a vehicle matching the frame numbers Adrian had photographed. The build log included a chassis code. The chassis code matched. At the bottom of the email she had written, "I don't need to tell you what this means. I think you already know. I would strongly recommend you take very seriously what you do next, and who you tell, and when. There are people who have been looking for this vehicle for a very long time." Adrian read the email twice. Then he closed the laptop and set it aside and sat with his knees up in the quiet garage, looking at the wreck on the lift. It was still ugly, still damaged, still the thing the whole neighborhood had laughed at a week ago. But he knew what it was now. The question was what to do about it. Outside, Sycamore Drive was waking up. He could hear the Nguyen kids' voices, distant, a car starting. The Saturday sounds of an ordinary neighborhood with no idea that the quiet man in the garage at number 12 was sitting in the middle of something extraordinary. Adrian Calloway set down his coffee, stood up, and walked back to the car. He had work to do. The email from Deborah Shanks sat in Adrian's laptop like a small explosive device he hadn't yet decided what to do with. He'd read it 4 times by Sunday morning. Each time the words rearranged themselves slightly in his understanding. Not the meaning, which was clear, but the weight of the meaning, which kept getting heavier. He'd printed it once, looked at the printed copy, and then torn it up and put it in the kitchen trash under the coffee grounds because having it on paper felt like leaving a window open. Mason had woken up at 6:45 that Sunday asking for cereal, and Adrian had made it, and they'd sat at the kitchen table together with the television off the way they always did on weekend mornings. And Adrian had watched his son eat Cheerios with the focused dedication of someone taking the task seriously, and he had thought, not yet for any of this. He needed more before he moved. That was the thing about making decisions with incomplete information. He'd watched enough people do it, in business and in life, to know that the speed of a decision was almost never its most important quality. What mattered was what you knew when you made it. So he went back to work. The second week with the car was different from the first. The cleaning phase was mostly done. What remained was examination, methodical, documented, the kind of work that required a camera and a notebook more than a wire brush. Adrian photographed everything, every weld seam, every machine surface, every stamped number he could find, and he found 6 more after the first one, scattered through the frame and subframe in places that suggested deliberate obscurity. Not hidden, exactly, but placed where only someone looking very carefully would find them. Frank Welder, whoever he had been, had not made things easy to read. But he had made them possible to read, for someone patient enough. Adrian was patient. He cross-referenced each new marking against the documentation Deborah had sent. A partial scan of the build log, 14 pages of faded type, and hand-notated margins that she'd photographed from a microfilm archive at the Chicago Racing Federation's historical collection. The handwriting in the margins was cramped and precise, the notes of an engineer who thought faster than he wrote and was trying to keep up with himself. Some of it Adrian could read. Some of it required him to stare at the screen for extended periods until the shapes resolved into letters. On Monday night, he found the plate. It was underneath the dashboard mounting bracket, in a location so deliberately inconspicuous that he almost missed it even knowing to look carefully. A small aluminum plate, riveted to the frame, no larger than a business card. The surface was corroded but not destroyed. Under the magnifying lamp and with a chemical treatment that took 40 minutes to work properly, 7 characters emerged from the corrosion. He looked at them for a long time. Then he typed them into his laptop. The results confirmed what Deborah's documentation had suggested. The plate was a builder's mark, a specific identifier that Caldwell Rice Motorsports had used on all vehicles that cleared their internal fabrication certification. It meant the car had been completed. Not just started, not abandoned mid-build, but finished and certified by the team's own standards. The prototype had been completed, and then it had disappeared for 40 years into a salvage yard in Houston. Adrian sat back in his garage chair and stared at the ceiling for a while. The work light hummed. From Mason's room distantly, he could hear the sound of his son talking in his sleep, a habit Mason had inherited from Rachel, who had carried on entire coherent-sounding conversations while fully unconscious, which had confused Adrian significantly during the first months of their marriage before he understood what was happening. He thought about her for a moment, not with the usual bracing quality the thoughts arrived with. More just, you would have had something to say about this. Rachel had always had something to say. She'd had opinions about everything from municipal planning to the ethics of buffet restaurants, and she'd delivered them with the confidence of someone who had done the research and was not particularly interested in debate. He had loved this about her in the way you love things that simultaneously exasperate you. She would have said something practical, something that cut through the complexity to whatever the actual question was. The actual question was, what now? He had something extraordinary sitting in his garage. He had documentation that could support, not prove yet, but support, what he believed it was. He had 3 experts who had seen photographs and reacted with the kind of urgency that didn't attach itself to ordinary things. He had a neighborhood full of people waiting for him to either produce something remarkable or confirm that he was, as Roger Pressman had said, a man who had paid $100 too much. He poured the last of the cold coffee into his mug and drank it without complaint and picked up his camera and went back to work. It was 11:30 at night. He had work tomorrow, calls with his company's operations team, a situation in their Denver data center that had been developing for 2 weeks and required his attention. Mason had school. The lawn needed cutting. He worked until 2. Evelyn brought the red thermos on Tuesday and Wednesday both. She had stopped making explanations for it after the first time, which Adrian appreciated because he had noticed during the explanations that she was better than the explanations gave her credit for. She was sharp and direct in a way that revealed itself gradually, the way warm weather reveals itself in February. Not all at once, but accumulating. On Wednesday, she brought a second mug, her own, which was a development Adrian registered without comment. They talked more on Wednesday than they had on any previous night. She asked better questions than most people. Not about the car's value or what he was going to do with it. The questions everyone around her seemed to be asking, based on the amount of foot traffic that continued to cruise past number 12, but about the engineering itself. About what made the geometry unusual. About Frank Welder and what it meant to disappear from your own history. Do you think he meant to disappear? She asked. Or do you think it just happened to him? Adrian considered this. I think some disappearances are chosen and some are fallen into, he said. And sometimes the person doing the disappearing isn't sure which it is until later. She looked at him over the rim of her mug. That sounds like something you've thought about before. I've thought about most things before, he said, which was true and also not entirely the answer to what she'd asked. She didn't push it. She had a quality he was starting to identify, an ability to recognize when a door was not fully closed and to stand near it without forcing it. It was a more sophisticated quality than it appeared, and it was rarer than people seemed to understand. On Thursday, the automotive world found out. He didn't know exactly how it happened. He had been careful. He believed he had been careful. The photographs he'd sent were stripped of location data. The questions he'd asked were oblique. But Deborah Shanks, for all her archival discipline, apparently had a contact in the vintage racing community with whom she had shared her excitement at a level that exceeded her discretion, and that contact had a forum presence, and the forum had several thousand members, some of whom treated this kind of intelligence the way day traders treat market rumors. By Thursday afternoon, there was a thread on a vintage motorsport forum titled Caldwell Rice Prototype, Located? That had 47 replies before Adrian found it at 7 p.m. while making Mason's dinner. He stood at the stove with a spatula in one hand and his phone in the other, reading the thread with the feeling of a man watching water seep under a door he'd thought was sealed. The thread was mostly speculation. Nobody had a location. Nobody had a name. But the photographs he'd sent Deborah had apparently been shared. He could see the watermarks had been cropped. And several people on the forum had reached the same conclusion he had about the frame numbers, which meant the information was no longer contained. He finished making dinner. He served Mason his spaghetti and sat across from him and listened to Mason's account of an injustice that had occurred at recess involving a disputed boundary in a game whose rules Mason explained with the intensity of a legal argument. Adrian asked appropriate questions. He helped with the homework that followed. He read 2 chapters of the book they were working through together, which was an adventure story about a 12-year-old who discovered a map and whose parents were both conveniently absent from the plot, as was traditional. He put Mason to bed. Then he went to the garage and called Deborah Shanks. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd been expecting the call. "I know," she said, before he said anything. "How much did you tell him?" A pause. "More than I should have. I'm sorry, Adrian. I was excited. You have to understand, I've been looking at records and documentation of this car for 15 years. When I thought it might actually exist..." She stopped. "It doesn't excuse it. I should have been more careful." "It's out now," he said. "Yes." "Who's going to come looking?" Another pause, this one heavier. "The forum membership includes people who work for several major collections, private collectors who have standing offers for anything connected to Caldwell Rice, and..." She hesitated. "Victor Laurent has a Google alert for that chassis code. Has for years, I'm told." The name landed in the garage like something physical. Victor Laurent was not a name that required explanation in motorsport circles, and Adrian knew the circles well enough. Laurent was 73 years old, French-American, and had spent 40 years building one of the most significant private automotive collections in the world from a base in Santa Fe, New Mexico. He had raced himself in his 30s, Formula Atlantic style, some endurance work, before an accident in 1981 ended his driving career and redirected his formidable energy into acquisition and preservation. His collection was rumored to contain vehicles that museums had been trying to borrow for decades. He was known for 2 things equally: his taste, which was exceptional, and his persistence, which was legendary. He had been publicly associated with the search for the Caldwell Rice prototype at least twice in automotive press coverage that Adrian had already found in his research. Once in a 2009 interview where he'd called it the most significant unrecovered vehicle in American motorsport history. Once in a 2017 charity auction where he'd purchased a fragment of what was claimed to be original Caldwell Rice bodywork, later determined to be a fabrication, for an amount that had caused considerable comment at the time. "How long do I have?" Adrian asked. "Before someone shows up," Deborah said. "If Laurent has a Google alert and the forum post is indexed, I wouldn't assume more than a few days." He looked at the car, at the dents and the damage and the work he'd done and the work that remained. At the plate he'd uncovered Monday night, the 7 characters that confirmed what the car was. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "I'm sorry I created the problem," she said. "You confirmed what I already knew," he said. "The problem would have come eventually." He hung up and sat in the garage with his hands on his knees for a while, thinking. The neighborhood was quiet. The work light hummed. The car sat on the lift under the fluorescent glow, still damaged, still ugly, but no longer anonymous. He thought about what to do next and made a decision that surprised him slightly, which was that he wasn't going to do anything yet. He was going to keep working. He was going to document everything he could document in the time he had, because whatever happened next, he wanted to know this car fully before it became something else, before it became an event instead of a project, before the world arrived and took it out of the quiet space of what it had been, when it was just him and a $100 wreck and a work light and cold coffee. He picked up his camera. He had a few days. He was going to use them. The next morning, Friday, Mason announced at breakfast that several kids at school had asked him if his dad was famous. Adrian looked up from his coffee. "What did you say?" "I said no," Mason said. "Are you?" "No," Adrian said. Mason considered this with the thorough fairness he applied to most questions. "Okay," he said. "But Tommy Nguyen said his mom heard that you found something important in the car." "Tommy Nguyen's mom doesn't know what's in the car." "That's what I said." Mason ate a spoonful of cereal. "I said Dad doesn't talk about the car to people." He paused. "Except to the coffee lady." Adrian looked at his son. "The coffee lady. Evelyn. She comes with the red thermos." Mason said this with the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting observable facts. "She stays for a long time." "She's a neighbor," Adrian said. "Mm-hmm," Mason said, in a tone that implied he was filing this information in a category Adrian might not have intended. Adrian drank his coffee and said nothing further, which was a tactical decision. He called Evelyn that afternoon, which was the first time he had called her. He'd gotten her number from the building's shared information sheet that all tenants on the block had contributed to, which had seemed appropriate and also slightly cowardly, a distinction he chose not to examine. She picked up on the third ring. "Adrian?" "The situation has changed," he said. "With the car. I thought you should know." A beat. "How changed?" "Information got out. There are people in the vintage motorsport community who know something has been found. I don't think anyone knows where yet, but that's probably temporary." "How temporary?" "Days," he said. "Maybe less." She was quiet for a moment. He could hear background noise. The diner, probably, the sound of a kitchen working. "What does that mean for you?" "It means I need to decide some things before someone else decides them for me." He paused. "I thought you might want to be around for that conversation." The pause before she answered was short. "What time?" "Tonight, after Mason's asleep, 8:30. "I'll bring the thermos," she said. She arrived at 8:25, which he noticed. She had changed out of her work clothes, dark jeans and a green jacket that was slightly too big for her in a way that managed not to look bad. And she brought not just the thermos, but a box of the butter cookies from Ronnie's that were, objectively, one of the better things Ronnie's produced. Mason was asleep. The garage was warm. The October nights had dropped further, and he'd turned up the space heater. The car sat on the lift, cleaned and photographed and documented, more known than it had been a week ago, but still carrying its damage, still carrying all the years it had spent being nobody's priority. He told her everything, not in pieces, not carefully managed, all of it in order, from the frame markings to Deborah Shanks, to the forum thread to Victor Laurent's name and what it meant. He told her about Frank Welder and what he'd reconstructed of the man's history, which wasn't much but was more than nothing. He told her about the aluminum plate under the dashboard bracket and the 7 characters and what they confirmed. She listened without interrupting, which was a thing she did well. She ate one of the butter cookies and held her mug in both hands and looked at the car while he talked. And when he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "So someone's coming," she said. "Yes." "And you haven't decided what to do?" "I know some of what I want," he said. "I haven't figured out how to get it." She looked at him. "What do you want?" It was the direct question, and he'd known she'd ask it eventually because directness was one of her primary qualities, and he'd been thinking about the answer for 2 days. "I want the car to mean something," he said, "not just to be worth something. Those are different." She was quiet again. Outside, a car went past on Sycamore Drive, its headlights briefly crossing the garage wall. "Frank Welder built something extraordinary," Adrian said, "and then it disappeared, and so did he, and most of the world has no idea either of them ever existed. If I sell this car to whoever gets here first and it goes into a private collection somewhere and sits in a climate-controlled room where nobody sees it..." He stopped. "That feels like losing him again." Evelyn set down her mug on the workbench, carefully, in the space between a socket wrench and a tube of anti-seize compound. She looked at the car for a long moment. "Then don't let that happen," she said. "It's complicated when there's significant money involved." "Most worthwhile things are complicated when there's significant money involved," she said. "That's not a reason." He almost smiled at that. It was the kind of thing Rachel would have said, and the comparison arrived with the usual complexity. Not painful exactly, more like pressing on a place that was still healing. He acknowledged it and let it pass. "Victor Laurent has been looking for this car for decades," he said. "When he gets here. And he will get here, so he'll have a number ready. It'll be a number designed to make it hard to think clearly." "Will it work?" "I'm a billionaire," he said flatly. "Money doesn't..." He caught himself. It was the first time he'd said it to her. The word just landed there in the garage between them. She didn't react the way most people reacted. She didn't go still, didn't recalibrate the way he'd watched people recalibrate when they found out, reassessing everything they'd said in the new light of the information, adjusting their posture toward him. She just looked at him steadily. "Okay," she said. "That's it?" he said. "What do you want me to say?" He considered this. "Most people have more of a reaction." "I figured," she said. "The truck with the cracked mirror, the flannel shirts. You're not broke, but you also don't want people to know you're not broke. That's a specific choice." She picked up her mug again. "I just didn't know the number." Does the number change anything? She thought about it honestly, which he appreciated. It changes the math on the stress you're carrying about Victor Laurent, she said. But it doesn't change anything about you. He was quiet. The point is, she said, you have leverage. If you walk into that conversation already knowing what you want, he can't move you with the number. The number's not the thing you're negotiating for. He looked at her. What am I negotiating for? Legacy, she said. You said it yourself. The car has to mean something, so make that the condition. You know what you want? Make it unmovable and let him work around it. It was not complicated advice. It was the kind of thing that sounded obvious once someone said it, and that he'd been circling for 2 days without landing on because he'd been too close to the problem. He had a tendency to over-engineer solutions when the straightforward version was available, and he knew this about himself, and it still kept happening. You're good at this, he said. I've done a lot of negotiating with landlords and shift managers, she said. The principle is the same. Know what you won't give up before you sit down. He nodded slowly. They sat in the warm garage with their coffee and the car and the space heater and the quiet of the neighborhood around them. A neighbor's sprinkler system started up somewhere. Someone had their timer set wrong for October and ran for a few minutes and shut off. Can I ask you something? Evelyn said. Yes. Why did you buy this car? She looked at it. Not the version you told Bertram. The real reason. The question sat in the air for a moment. He'd known it was coming eventually, in the way you know certain questions are waiting for you when someone is paying the kind of attention she paid. Because I recognized it, he said. Not the car specifically, just the thing underneath. Something everyone else has walked past. Something that got broken and nobody bothered to look at after that. He set down his mug. I've been spending 2 years feeling like that. She didn't fill the silence. She let it be what it was. I'm okay, he said, which was the sentence he'd been saying for 2 years. I just haven't. It's been hard to find the thing that makes me want to be somewhere, you know? Not just somewhere I'm supposed to be. Somewhere I actually want to be. He stopped. He hadn't said that to anyone. He wasn't sure why he'd said it to her, except that the garage at night had a quality that made certain things possible. I think I know what that's like, she said quietly. The feeling of going through the motions and waiting for something to feel real again. He looked at her. My life is not... I'm not comparing, she said quickly. What you've been through is different, but... She turned her mug in her hands. 3 years at the same diner, the same shifts, the same amount in the same bank account, no matter how carefully I manage it. There are days when I feel like I'm just... She didn't finish. Moving through it, he said. Yeah, she said, moving through it. They sat with that for a while. The space heater hummed. The car sat between them and around them in the way objects do when they become part of a moment, present, and also something more than themselves. I'm glad you stopped on the sidewalk that first night, he said. She looked at him with the beginning of a smile that she didn't quite let finish. I almost didn't. I know. I could tell. Could you? You had the expression of someone who had already talked themselves out of it and then didn't quite manage to walk away. She laughed. A short, real laugh, not polished. That is very accurate. He smiled. It was the full version, which was something Mason saw regularly and the rest of Sycamore Drive had never seen. They stayed until 10:30. When she left this time, walking up the street with the empty thermos, Adrian stood in the garage doorway and watched the neighborhood and thought about a man named Frank Welder who had built something extraordinary and let it disappear. And he thought about the difference between things that disappear because they're abandoned and things that disappear because they're waiting. He went inside. He checked on Mason, asleep, one arm hanging off the bed, in the specific graceless way of a child who had committed fully to unconsciousness. And he stood in the doorway of his son's room for a moment. The call came on Saturday morning at 9:47 while Adrian was teaching Mason to check the oil on the F-25. Oh, which was a practical skill Adrian believed should be part of a standard childhood curriculum. It was a 505 area code. Santa Fe. He answered it. He handed Mason the dipstick to examine on his own and walked to the end of the driveway. The voice on the phone was accented, the French underneath the American English still present after decades. and careful in the way of a man who had been in enough negotiations to know that the first 30 seconds determined the shape of everything that followed. "Mr. Calloway," the voice said, "my name is Victor Laurent. I believe we have something to discuss." Adrian looked down the length of Sycamore Drive, at the modest houses and the maintained lawns and the neighborhood that had watched him drag home a rusted wreck, and laughed about it, and felt something settle in him. Not certainty exactly, something more like readiness. "Mr. Laurent," he said, "I know who you are, and yes, I think we do." There was a pause, and then Laurent said with something that might have been relief after a very long wait, "May I come to Beaumont?" "You can come Tuesday," Adrian said. "I have some things I need to finish first." He hung up and stood in the driveway for a moment. From under the truck, Mason's voice, "Dad, the oil looks kind of brown." "That means it needs changing," Adrian said, and walked back to his son. Across the street, Dale Hutchins had come out for his morning paper and was watching with the specific expression of a man who knows something is happening and cannot figure out what it is. Adrian nodded at him. Dale nodded back, uncertain. The car was in the garage. Tuesday was 3 days away. And in those 3 days, Adrian Calloway intended to know that vehicle as completely as it was possible to know it. Every weld and every marking and every piece of hand-built precision that Frank Welder had put into it before the world lost track of both of them. Before it became worth millions of dollars to someone else, he was going to understand what it had cost one man to build it. He owed Welder that much. He wasn't sure why he felt that way, only that he did, and that he'd learned in the last 2 years to trust the feelings that arrived without full explanation. He went back into the garage and got to work. Sunday he photographed for 6 hours. Monday he documented. Monday night, after Mason was asleep, he called his company's legal team and had a 40-minute conversation that the lawyer on the other end found somewhat unusual, but followed with the professional neutrality of someone being paid to follow things. He had a framework in mind. It was not complicated. It was, in fact, exactly what Evelyn had said. Know what you won't give up before you sit down. He knew. By the time Tuesday morning arrived, Sycamore Drive was doing the thing that Sycamore Drive did when it sensed something. The slow-motion gathering that looked like coincidence but wasn't. Darlene Hutchins was gardening, which she never did on weekday mornings. Roger Pressman's car was in his driveway, which it shouldn't have been on a Tuesday. Keisha Washington was pushing the twins in the stroller in a route that happened to take her past number 12 at intervals. The black SUVs arrived at 11. 2 of them, Texas plates, the kind of vehicle that announced resources without advertising them. They parked in front of Adrian's house with the coordinated efficiency of a team that traveled together regularly. Victor Laurent got out of the second one. He was smaller than photographs suggested, not physically diminished, but compacted, the way people who have spent a lifetime moving through the world with intention can appear smaller than they are until they speak. He was 73, but moved without the apology of age. He wore a dark jacket that cost more than a month of Evelyn's diner salary, and he stood on the sidewalk in front of number 12 and looked at the house with the expression of a man who has been moving towards something for a very long time and has finally arrived. Adrian was already standing in the driveway, hands in his pockets, in the worn flannel shirt with the busted button. Laurent walked toward him. He stopped a few feet away and looked at Adrian with dark, evaluating eyes that had spent 50 years assessing things of value. "Mr. Calloway," he said. "Mr. Laurent." Adrian nodded. "Is it here?" Laurent said. He asked it simply, without preamble, and the simplicity of it, the 40 years of waiting compressed into 3 words, was something Adrian registered. "It's here," he said. "Come and see." He led Victor Laurent into the garage, and he stepped aside and he watched the 73-year-old man see for the first time the thing he had spent decades looking for. What happened to Laurent's face in that moment was something Adrian had not quite prepared for. He'd expected satisfaction, or the practiced containment of a man who had been in enough high-stakes situations to control his reactions. He did not expect the way Laurent's shoulders changed, dropping by a degree that probably nobody who didn't know him would notice, or the single exhale, slow and long, like a man setting down something very heavy. Laurent walked to the car. He didn't touch it immediately. He walked around it slowly, looking, the way Adrian had looked at it in the salvage yard. He crouched in one spot, stood, crouched in another. And then he put his hand on the frame rail and left it there. After a minute, without turning, he said, "Do you know what you have?" "Yes," Adrian said. Laurent turned. His eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with money. "Then you know," he said, "that this is one of the most significant finds in the history of American motorsport." "I know," Adrian said. Laurent straightened, and then he named a number. It was $5 million. He said it the way a man says it when he has said it before, in his own mind, many times, not casually, but without drama. A considered number, a number meant to settle things. Adrian listened to it land. He thought about what Evelyn had said. He thought about Frank Welder. He thought about the aluminum plate with 7 characters that confirmed what the car was, and the 40 years it had spent being nobody's priority, and the way Laurent's hand had rested on the frame rail. "I'll consider it," he said. "But I have a condition." Laurent looked at him steadily. "Tell me." And Adrian told him. Outside on Sycamore Drive, 11 people who had been finding reasons to be visible on a Tuesday morning watched the 2 men through the open garage door, the old man in the expensive jacket and the quiet one in the flannel shirt, and could not hear a word that was being said, which was, as it turned out, exactly the way Adrian Calloway had wanted it. Victor Laurent did not respond immediately to Adrian's condition. That was notable. In Adrian's experience, and he had sat across from enough people in enough rooms to have developed a reliable read on negotiating behavior, the people who responded immediately to an unexpected condition were the ones who hadn't truly heard it. They were reacting to the shape of it before the content landed. Laurent didn't do that. He stood in the garage with his hand no longer on the car and his dark eyes on Adrian, and he was quiet for long enough that it became a specific kind of quiet, the kind that means the person inside it is doing real work. One of the men from the SUVs, younger, suited, with the alert stillness of an assistant who had learned to anticipate, shifted slightly near the garage door. Laurent made a small gesture with 2 fingers, barely visible, and the man went still again. "Tell me the condition again," Laurent said. "The car goes on public display," Adrian said. "Not a private collection, not a climate-controlled room that 3 people a year see by appointment. A museum with public access, and the story of Frank Welder goes with it. Full documentation, properly attributed, properly told. The engineering, the history, the man, all of it." Laurent looked at him. "That's not negotiable," Adrian said. "The number can be discussed. That part isn't." The garage held the sound of the space heater and nothing else for a moment. "You know what most people would do," Laurent said, "with a $5 million offer on a car they bought for $100. "I know what most people would do," Adrian said. "I'm not most people." "Why does the engineer matter to you?" Laurent said. "You never met him. He's been gone for 40 years. Adrian looked at the car, at the damage and the rust and the work he'd done over the last 10 days, all the hours spent learning the vehicle the way you learn something you intend to keep faith with. Because he built something that changed how people think about a problem, Adrian said, and the world lost him and lost the work at the same time, and someone should fix that." Laurent was quiet again. He walked slowly around the front of the car and looked at the damaged bodywork without touching it this time. "I know a Frank Welder story," he said, after a moment. Adrian waited. "Not a complete one," Laurent said. "I've been looking for this car long enough to collect pieces." He stopped at the passenger side. Welder was not from a racing family. He was a structural engineer by training, buildings, bridges. He came to motorsport sideways through a friend who raced amateur events in the late 60s. He had no business being as good at it as he was. He ran a finger along the top of the fender, just barely touching it. The ideas he put into this car, the frame geometry, the suspension work, they weren't just clever. They were decades ahead. He had figured out things about load distribution under racing conditions that the major teams didn't understand until the 80s. Laurent looked up. "Some of his ideas appear in vehicles that won championships, Mr. Calloway. Nobody credited him. Nobody could, because nobody knew he'd had them first. The documentation was believed destroyed. Until now," Adrian said. "Until you photographed 14 pages of a build log and a chassis plate that nobody else had found in 40 years. Laurent looked at him with something that wasn't quite admiration but was in the neighborhood of it. "Where did you find the plate?" "Under the dashboard bracket." Laurent exhaled. I looked at photographs of 7 vehicles over 40 years that people claimed might be the prototype. None of them were. I never thought to look under the dashboard bracket. He shook his head once. Because it's a ridiculous place to put a certification plate. It's the last place anyone would look, Adrian said, which was probably the point. Welder didn't trust people, Laurent said. There are things in the documentation, when I finally tracked down what records still existed, that suggest he knew the team was in financial trouble, that the car might be sold or lost or misrepresented. He left himself a way to authenticate it that only someone who knew the whole build would find. Adrian stood with this for a moment. The image of Frank Welder, a structural engineer who came to racing sideways, who built something 40 years ahead of its time, who hid his authentication mark in the last place anyone would look because he didn't trust the world to take care of his work, sat in the garage alongside the car itself. I'll meet your condition, Laurent said. Adrian looked at him. The Caldwell Rice prototype goes to the Southwest Automotive History Museum in Santa Fe, Laurent said. Full public access. I've been in discussions with them for 2 years about a Caldwell Rice exhibit. They have archive material, some original photographs. The car would be the centerpiece. He paused. Welder's story goes with it. I'll fund the research to complete the documentation. Whatever can be found, we find. And his name is on the exhibit, Adrian said. Not in small print. His name is on the exhibit. His name is on the exhibit, Laurent said. Adrian nodded. The number, Laurent said. 5 million. Accepted, Adrian said, and he said it without hesitation, which Laurent seemed to register. You didn't try to negotiate it up, Laurent said. The money wasn't the hard part, Adrian said. Laurent looked at him steadily. No, he said. I can see that. They shook hands. Laurent's grip was firm in the way of a man who had been shaking hands on significant agreements for 50 years. Adrian's was the same. How long do you need to prepare the paperwork? Adrian asked. My team can have documents by Thursday, Laurent said. Standard provenance transfer, authentication clauses, the public display covenant. You should have your legal team review the covenant specifically. I'll make sure it has teeth, but you should verify that for yourself. I will, Adrian said. Laurent took one more look at the car, a long one, the kind that carries a lot of time inside it. I would like to ask you something personal, Laurent said. Adrian waited. How did you see it? Laurent asked. In the salvage yard, under all of that. He gestured at the car's damage. What made you stop? Adrian thought about the moment, crouching in the dirt at Bertram's salvage yard, his hand running along the frame rail, Mason somewhere behind him cataloging everything by color and assigning it a points value. The geometry was wrong, he said. Not wrong, different. The pickup points were in positions I hadn't seen before. It didn't match any production vehicle I knew. He paused. And somebody had built this thing very carefully. Under all the damage, you could still feel the care in it. I don't know how else to describe it. Laurent nodded slowly. Frank Welder, he said, put 18 months into that car. By hand, mostly alone from what I've been able to piece together. The team gave him the space and the materials and largely left him to it, which was either their smartest or their most negligent decision depending on how you look at it. Probably both, Adrian said. But probably both, Laurent agreed. He left with his team at 12:30. The black SUVs pulled away from Sycamore Drive in the coordinated way they'd arrived, and the street went back to its ordinary appearance, and the 11 neighbors who had been finding reasons to be visible on a Tuesday morning dispersed with the frustrated expressions of people who had witnessed something significant without being able to determine what it was. Adrian stood in the driveway and watched the SUVs go and felt something he hadn't expected to feel, which was a kind of grief, not regret. He didn't regret the decision. The condition was right. He'd known it before Laurent arrived. But there was something in the fact of the handshake, the formality of it, the finality, that made the car suddenly, concretely, no longer his. Not yet, technically. But the direction was set. The trajectory was fixed. He went inside and made himself a sandwich he didn't taste and sat at the kitchen table for a while with the television off, which was his rule on weekend mornings and which he'd extended on some days to Tuesday afternoons when he needed to think. Mason was at school. The house was quiet in the midday way that houses are quiet, not peaceful exactly, but empty of the specific sounds that make a place feel occupied. Adrian sat with the quiet and the sandwich and the fact of what he'd just done. $5 million was not, to him, a life-changing number. He knew this, and he was uncomfortable with knowing it, in the way he was always uncomfortable with the discrepancy between his circumstances and the way most people lived. Evelyn worked doubles at a diner. Bertram ran a salvage yard at 71. His company's Denver operations team was made up of people who worried about quarterly reviews. He'd been thinking about that discomfort for 2 years. He'd been thinking specifically about what Rachel would have done with it. Rachel had not been comfortable with money in the abstract. She'd been practical about it. She hadn't romanticized poverty or pretended wealth was morally straightforward, but she had also never stopped believing that the point of having resources was to do something with them, not something impressive, something honest. He'd been sitting on his own discomfort for 2 years and doing nothing about it, which was, he recognized, a failure of the kind Rachel would have been specific about. He finished the sandwich. He washed the plate. He called his legal team and gave them the parameters for reviewing Laurent's covenant documents. Then he went to the garage and stood in front of the car for a long time. "Okay," he said, to no one, or possibly to Frank Welder, who wasn't there. "I'm going to do something with it." He went inside and opened his laptop. Evelyn found out about the handshake from Mason. This was not the order in which Adrian had intended information to travel, but Mason arrived home from school at 3:15 with the after-school care teacher, as he always did on Tuesdays, and the first thing he said, dropping his backpack by the door with his characteristic disregard for its contents, was, "Tommy Nguyen's mom says there were fancy cars outside our house today. Did you sell the car to the fancy car people?" Adrian was on a call with his Denver operations team, which had been ongoing for 45 minutes and had not yet resolved the data center situation. He held up one finger in Mason's direction, which Mason interpreted correctly as, "Wait, I'm working," and Mason got himself a juice box from the refrigerator with the practiced independence of a child who has learned not to require assistance for juice acquisition. When the call ended at 4, Mason was on the kitchen floor drawing, and Adrian sat down across from him. "How did Tommy Nguyen's mom know about the cars?" Adrian asked. "She was walking past," Mason said, without looking up from his drawing. "She said they were Mercedes. Are Mercedes fancy?" "They're expensive." "Same thing?" "Mostly," Adrian said. "Yes, I had a meeting today. About the car." Mason looked up. "Did you sell it?" "We shook hands," Adrian said. "The paperwork isn't done yet." Mason processed this. His face moved through something complicated and then settled. "Is that okay?" he said. "That you sold it?" It was a better question than most adults would have thought to ask, and Adrian sat with it for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "It's okay. It's going somewhere good." "A museum?" "A museum." Mason nodded, satisfied. He went back to his drawing, which appeared to be a vehicle with approximately 12 wheels arranged in a configuration that defied engineering. "Can we go see it when it's in the museum?" "Yes," Adrian said. "We're definitely going to go see it." He called Evelyn at 5 before her dinner shift started. "Laurent came," he said. "I know," she said. "Mason texted me." Adrian stopped. "Mason texted you?" "He has my number. We exchanged numbers last week when he wanted to ask me something about coloring pencils." A pause. "He said you shook hands with a fancy car man and that it was okay." "He's surprisingly accurate for 7, Adrian said. "What was the condition?" He told her. All of it. Laurent's agreement, the Southwest Automotive History Museum, the welder exhibit, the public access covenant. He told her about the conversation before the handshake, what Laurent had said about Welder being a structural engineer who came to racing sideways, about the ideas that showed up in championship-winning vehicles decades later with no attribution. She was quiet for a moment when he finished. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Strange," he said honestly, "like something ended and something else is about to start and I'm standing between them." "That's usually accurate," she said, "about those kinds of moments." He told her the number. She went quiet in a different way. $5 million, she said. "Yes." "For $100 a car." "The $100 was something of an undervaluation," he said. She laughed, short and real. Then, "What are you going to do with it?" He told her about that, too, The thing he'd been thinking about since the sandwich in the quiet kitchen. The thing Rachel would have said he'd been sitting on for too long. I want to set something up, he said. A fund. For families in situations like... He stopped, found the words. I was lucky. I could disappear from the world when I needed to, and my son didn't suffer for it financially, and I know how unusual that is. I know what it looks like when people don't have that. My operations team, some of them have kids and they're working on margins I couldn't live on for a week. He paused. My wife's name was Rachel. I want it to be called the Rachel Calloway Foundation. Scholarship fund, emergency support, that kind of thing. Local first, but expandable. The line was quiet for long enough that he said, Evelyn? I'm here, she said. I just... She stopped. That's a good thing, Adrian. It's overdue, he said. Maybe, she said, but it's still good. He could hear the diner behind her now, the shift about to start, the sounds of an industrial kitchen waking up. He knew she needed to go. Thank you, he said, for last week, for what you said about knowing what you won't give up. You already knew it, she said. I just said it out loud. She hung up. He sat with the phone in his hand for a moment and then set it on the counter and went to start Mason's dinner. The week that followed was quiet in the way that weeks are quiet after large decisions, a false calm, the kind that means everything is moving underneath the surface and you just can't see it yet. The legal documents arrived Thursday as Laurent had promised. Adrian's attorney, a methodical woman named Sandra Fitch, who operated out of Houston and had handled his company's legal work for 6 years, called him Thursday evening with her review. The covenant is solid, Sandra said. Better than I expected, honestly. The public display requirement is binding in perpetuity. Not just during Laurent's ownership, it transfers with the vehicle to any subsequent institution. The welder attribution is specifically defined. Name on the primary exhibit placard. Name in all published materials related to the collection. She paused. He also added something that wasn't in your original condition. What? A research clause, Sandra said. Laurent commits to funding an independent research effort to document Welder's complete body of work, not just the prototype, but everything they can find from his career. Any publications that result have to credit Welder as primary subject. It's not legally enforceable the way the display covenant is, but it's in writing. Adrian was quiet. That's more than you asked for, Sandra said. I know, Adrian said. He wants this story told, she said. The man, not just the car. Yes, Adrian said. I think he does. He signed Thursday night. Scanned, emailed, done. The car was no longer his in any meaningful sense, though it would remain in his garage until Laurent's transport team arrived in 2 weeks to take it to Santa Fe. 2 weeks. He wasn't sure how he felt about those 2 weeks, except that he intended to use them. He went to the garage after Mason was asleep and stood in front of the car for a long time. Not working. Just standing. He'd been working on it for nearly 3 weeks now, and he knew it in the way you know something you've spent hours with in silence. Not intimately, the way you know a person, but specifically. He knew where each marking was. He knew the sound the frame made when he tapped certain sections. He knew where Welder had been meticulous and where he'd improvised, and the improvisation was always more interesting than the meticulousness. He wondered about this man, about the 18 months he'd spent building this thing by hand, mostly alone, while the team's finances deteriorated around him, about whether he'd known, by the end, that the car was never going to race, about what it felt like to watch the thing you'd spent the best of yourself on disappear into a fire, or what you believed was a fire, about choosing, after that, to disappear yourself. Adrian understood the impulse. He'd acted on a version of it himself. The flannel shirts, the cracked mirror, Sycamore Drive. The impulse to become ungoogleable in the ways that mattered. The difference, he supposed, was that he'd had Mason, which was a powerful argument against disappearing completely. He wondered what Frank Welder's argument had been, or if there'd been one. On Friday, Darlene Hutchins finally got tired of operating on incomplete information and knocked on his door at 10 in the morning. He opened it to find her holding a plate of something baked, which was the neighborhood's established social currency for, I'm going to ask you something, and this is the price of admission. Good morning, she said. I made banana bread. He accepted the plate. Thank you, Darlene. There was a man here Tuesday, she said, without bothering to build to it. Expensive cars. Who was he? Adrian had been thinking about what to say to the neighborhood about the car. He'd been thinking about it since Tuesday, and he'd reached a conclusion that felt right in the way his decisions felt right when they aligned with something honest. "Come in," he said. He made coffee. She sat at his kitchen table with the specific alertness of a woman whose information network was about to receive a major update. He set coffee in front of her and sat across the table and told her the truth. Not all of it, not the financial details, but the essential shape. The car, the markings, Frank Welder, Victor Laurent, the museum in Santa Fe. He told it plainly, without drama, the way you tell true things. Darlene listened. For once in Adrian's experience of her, she listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, "The car everyone laughed at." "Yes." She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. "Lord," she said softly. He waited. "I told Dale it was worthless," she said. "We all said—" She stopped. "How did you know, just looking at it?" "I looked carefully, he said. "Most people don't look carefully at things that appear to be ruined." She sat with this in a way that suggested it had landed somewhere personal. "The man on Tuesday," she said. "He was the buyer?" "Yes, Victor Laurent. He's been looking for that car for 40 years. And you found it at a salvage yard for $100. Bertram's on Route 90, he said. She laughed, a surprised sound, quick and real. Then she sobered. "You're a quiet person," she said. I didn't know, none of us knew." She gestured vaguely, which seemed to encompass everything about him she hadn't known. "I prefer it that way," he said. She nodded, accepting this in a way that suggested she was recalibrating something fundamental about how she'd understood the neighborhood. "Well," she said. She drank her coffee. "The banana bread is good, for what it's worth." "It is," he said, which was true. She left 20 minutes later. By noon, Sycamore Drive knew the story in its broad outlines, which was inevitable and which Adrian had made peace with. What he hadn't anticipated was the knock on the garage door Saturday afternoon from Roger Pressman. Roger was 62, retired military, had lived on Sycamore Drive for 11 years, and had, on the day the car arrived, made the comment about burning it. He was not, in Adrian's assessment, a man with a particular gift for sentiment. He stood at the garage door in a Saturday fishing vest, which he wore regardless of whether he was going fishing, and looked at the car with his hands in his pockets. "Can I see it?" he said. Adrian let him in. Roger walked around the car the way most people who were genuinely looking at something walked around it, slowly, without talking. He crouched in a couple spots. He looked at the underside briefly, without touching. He stood back and looked at the whole thing. "I said it should be burned," Roger said without preamble. "I heard," Adrian said. "I was wrong." Adrian said nothing, which Roger seemed to take as the appropriate response. "What I can see," Roger said, "even without knowing what I'm looking at, whoever built this cared about it. You can see that, even with the damage." He put his hands back in his pockets. "I spent 22 years in the military, and I've seen a lot of things that looked broken. Sometimes they were, sometimes they weren't." He looked at Adrian. "I should have looked more carefully." It was a more substantial admission than Adrian had expected from Roger Pressman, and he received it with the same respect with which it had been offered. "Most people don't," Adrian said. "Doesn't make it right," Roger said. Then, "Where's it going?" "Museum in Santa Fe, 2 weeks." Roger nodded. He took one more look at the car. "Good," he said. "It should be somewhere people can see it." He walked to the garage door and then stopped. "The man who built it, Welder. Did he know it survived the fire?" "I don't know," Adrian said. "He might still be alive," Roger said, "if he's not too old." Adrian had thought about this. He'd thought about it quite a bit, actually. "He might be," he said. "Someone should look," Roger said. "Yes," Adrian said. "Someone should." Roger left. Adrian stood in the garage with Roger's question sitting in the space the man had vacated. He'd been trying not to think too directly about this, about the possibility that Frank Welder was not simply a historical figure, but a living person, somewhere, who had spent 40 years not knowing that the thing he'd built had survived. Because if Welder was alive, And if he'd spent 40 years believing the prototype was gone, believing his work was ash, then the discovery didn't just matter for the museum exhibit. It mattered for him. Adrian sat down on the garage floor, back against the workbench, and thought about that. He was still thinking about it when Evelyn appeared at the garage door at 6 with the red thermos and a paper bag from the diner. "I brought food," she said. "Real food, not just coffee. Ronnie's makes a decent chicken sandwich when the right person is on the grill." He hadn't eaten since the banana bread. He hadn't noticed until she said it. She sat on the overturned bucket, same spot as always, and he sat on the creeper he'd pulled out from under the workbench, and they ate the chicken sandwiches, which were, in fact, decent. Mason came out from the house in his pajamas at 6:30, which meant bedtime had already been negotiated down from 7 to 7:30, and he was conducting a final reconnaissance before the process became unavoidable. "Evelyn," Mason said, with the satisfaction of someone finding something they expected to find. "Hey, bud," she said. "Why are you in pajamas at 6:30? "Dad says 7:30, Mason said, making this sound like an injustice while also reporting it accurately. "He makes the rules," she said. Mason considered this philosophical position. "Do you want to see my drawing?" he said. "I made a new one." He produced it from somewhere. It had clearly been in his pajama pocket, which raised questions about his level of premeditation, and handed it to Evelyn. She looked at it with genuine attention, tilting it slightly as though calibrating for the correct angle. "This one has 17 wheels," she said. 18, Mason corrected. "One is behind the thing." "What thing?" "The thing in the back." Mason pointed at a shape that could have been many things. "It makes it go faster." "Of course," she said. She looked at him. "It's great. I like the colors." Mason received this with dignity and said goodnight to both of them, shook his father's hand. They had a handshake, complicated and specific, and went inside. The garage was quieter after Mason. "Roger Pressman came by today," Adrian said. "I know. I saw him go in." He asked if Welder might still be alive. Evelyn looked at him steadily. "What do you think?" "He'd be in his 80s, roughly, based on what I've been able to piece together about his career timeline." Adrian looked at the car. "He might be." "Laurent's research fund," she said. "That could find him." "If he can be found," Adrian said. "He disappeared on purpose. 40 years is a long time to be unfindable." "People disappear until someone looks hard enough," she said. "You found his car under 40 years of rust." He looked at her. There was something in the way she said it, the simple, direct confidence of it, that landed differently than the same observation would have from most people. "Laurent needs to know this might be possible," Adrian said, "before the exhibit goes public. If Welder is alive, he deserves to know the car survived before it becomes a news story." "Call Laurent," Evelyn said. "I will," he said. "Monday." She nodded. They sat with the car and the Saturday evening and the space heater and the October dark outside the garage door. The neighborhood had gone quiet in the way it went quiet at dinner time, the sounds of families settling into their evening routines filtering through from various directions. "Can I tell you something?" Evelyn said. "Yes," he said, which was the only answer he had for her. "I was going to move," she said, "at the end of the year. I've been thinking about it for months. The diner it's not going anywhere, and neither am I, and I had this vague idea about going back to school or trying something else somewhere else." She looked at the garage floor. "I hadn't decided, but I was thinking about it." He watched her. "I'm still thinking about it," she said, "but differently now." She looked up. "I just wanted you to know that." He understood what she was saying, and he understood that she was not saying more than she was saying, and that this was precise and correct for where they were. "I'm glad you stopped on the sidewalk," he said again, because it was still true. "You said that before," she said. "It's still true." She looked at him with a half smile that was the kind that happens when something lands exactly right, and you're trying not to make too much of it. They talked until 9. After she left, Adrian stood in the garage doorway and looked at the car. 2 weeks left in his garage, on his lift, under his work light. And he thought about all the things that had happened in 3 weeks. The salvage yard, and the rust, and the aluminum plate, and the forum thread, and Laurent's hand on the frame rail, and the handshake, and the sandwich he hadn't tasted, and Roger Pressman in a fishing vest saying someone should look. He thought about Frank Welder, who might be alive somewhere, who might not know what had been found. He thought about what it would mean for a man to spend 40 years believing the best thing he'd ever built was gone, and then to find out it wasn't. He thought about Rachel and how she would have said already before the call with Laurent, before the signed documents, "Stop standing in your own way and do the thing." He thought about Mason, who at 7 years old had looked at the same wreck the whole neighborhood was laughing at and asked simply, "What do we do first?" He turned off the work light. He went inside to check on his son. Adrien called Victor Laurent on Monday morning from the kitchen table, before Mason was awake, with the first cup of coffee still too hot to drink properly sitting in front of him. Laurent picked up on the second ring. He seemed to be a man who answered his phone quickly, which Adrien had noticed on the first call too. Not the behavior of someone who screened his communications through layers of staff, but of someone who had decided long ago that the direct line was worth maintaining. "I've been thinking about Welder," Adrien said without preamble. "About whether he's still alive." A pause on Laurent's end. Not surprise. More like the sound of a man who had been waiting for this specific conversation. "I've thought about it for 20 years, Laurent said. "Every time I got close to a lead on the car, I thought about it." And I could never find him, Laurent said. "I tried twice. Hired investigators. Once in 2004, once in 2011. Both times they confirmed the same basic timeline. Francis Allen Welder, born 1941 in Rockford, Illinois. Structural engineering degree from the University of Illinois, 1963. Worked in commercial construction through the late 60s. Became involved in motorsport through a personal connection around 1969. Joined Caldwell Rice Motorsports in 1972. Right, that's a pause. After the storage facility fire in 1974, the record goes flat. No tax filings after 75. No driver's license renewal. No property records. Nothing. That doesn't mean he's dead, Adrien said. No, Laurent agreed. It means he was serious about not being found. Adrien drank his coffee and looked out the kitchen window at the backyard, where the oak tree was doing the October thing of shedding leaves with no sense of urgency. "The research fund you added to the covenant," he said. "I want it to include a genuine effort to find Welder, not just his professional history. Him. The person." "That was already my intention," Laurent said. "I want to be involved," Adrien said. "Not as a funder, as someone who's actually looking." Another pause, this one different. "Why?" Adrien thought about how to answer this honestly. "Because I spent 3 weeks with something he built," he said. "I know the car. I know how he thought. If there's a way to find him, it's through the work, following the engineering ideas forward into what came after, finding the people who might have known him." He paused. "Investigators look for records. I'd look differently." Laurent was quiet for a moment. "You have other things to do," he said. "A company. A son." "I have resources," Adrien said, "and I'm good at finding things people say can't be found." He could hear Laurent considering this through the phone, not the sound of deliberation exactly, but the specific quality of silence that meant a man was deciding whether to say yes to something that had risk in it. "I'll send you everything I have from the 2004 and 2011 searches," Laurent said. "The investigators' files. Whatever documentation I've collected over the years about Welder's career." A pause. "If you find something, I need to know before it goes anywhere else. Before the press, before the museum announcement. If this man is alive, he deserves to hear it from a human being in a room, not from a news article." "Agreed," Adrien said. "And Adrien," Laurent stopped. "What?" "He's 82 years old if he's alive. And he spent 40 years believing his work was destroyed. Whatever you find..." He didn't finish the sentence. "I know," Adrien said. "I'll be careful." He hung up. Mason appeared in the kitchen doorway 40 seconds later in the pajamas he'd apparently never taken off, with his hair in the specific configuration of someone who had slept with tremendous commitment. "Who are you talking to?" Mason said. "The fancy car man." Mason opened the refrigerator and examined its contents with the critical eye of someone who has options. "About the car?" "About the man who built it." Mason selected a yogurt and located a spoon with the efficiency of long practice. "Is the man nice?" "I don't know yet," Adrien said. "I haven't found him." Mason sat down across from him and opened the yogurt. "Like a mystery?" "Exactly like a mystery," Adrien said. Mason stirred the yogurt thoughtfully. I'm good at mysteries, he said. At school, I found Tommy Nguyen's eraser that he thought was gone, and it was in the coat room behind the bucket. That's impressive detective work, Adrian said. I looked where nobody else looked, Mason said, as though this were the obvious method. Adrian looked at his son for a moment. Yeah, he said. That's the whole thing, actually. The Laurent files arrived Tuesday morning. A large compressed folder of scanned documents, investigator reports, photocopied records, and a separate PDF that was clearly Laurent's own notes, compiled over years, about the Caldwell-Rice prototype and everything connected to it. The PDF was 63 pages long and written in the cramped associative style of someone who had been adding to a document for decades without stopping to edit the earlier sections. Adrian read it all before noon. Laurent's investigators had approached the search the way investigators approached most searches, backwards from the present, looking for official records, digital footprints, institutional connections. Social Security, IRS, DMV, property records. The 2004 search had confirmed the last known address as a rooming house in Gary, Indiana, circa 1975. The 2011 search had pushed that slightly further, a possible sighting at a construction site in rural Tennessee in 1979, reported by someone who claimed to have recognized Welder from a motorsport magazine photograph, and described him as a thin man who knew a lot about stress loads. That was as far as either investigator had gotten. Adrian read the 2011 report 3 times, focusing on the Tennessee lead. It was thin. The investigator had noted it as low confidence and moved on. But there was a detail in the description that stayed with him. The source had said Welder had been consulting on a bridge repair project. Not working construction, consulting, which meant he'd still been using his structural engineering training, which meant there might be a thread to pull if you knew where to look. He called Deborah Shanks. I know you feel like you owe me, he said. I'm going to let you make it up to me. She laughed, short and a little pained. What do you need? Engineering records, he said. Specifically bridge repair projects in Tennessee, late 70s and early 80s. Any project where the consultant records are available. I'm looking for a name. Welder, or any variant, or someone who matches his description and background. That's going to be a significant archive search, Deborah said. I know, he said. I know it's not your area. It's not, she said. But I know people in structural engineering history who might know where to start. A pause. Can I ask why? He might be alive, Adrian said. The line was quiet for a moment. Francis Welder might be alive, she said slowly. 82 years old. Disappeared from the record in 1975. But there's a possible Tennessee sighting in 79 that the investigators dismissed because they were looking for official records, and he'd clearly stopped leaving any. He paused. Someone who knows engineering archives might look differently than someone who knows how to find people. Give me a few days, Deborah said. Thank you, he said. He spent the rest of Tuesday going through Laurent's own notes, which were more useful than the investigator reports in a different way. Laurent had been collecting fragments of Welder's professional history for decades. Not personal information, but technical information. Mentions in obscure motorsport publications. A brief acknowledgement in a 1972 Racing Federation technical bulletin. A single photograph, scanned and included in the PDF, showing the Caldwell-Rice garage in 1973 with 4 men visible, one of whom Laurent had labeled possibly FW in a note that suggested this was his best guess rather than confirmed identification. Adrian looked at the photograph for a long time. It was low quality, the way photographs from that era were when they'd been scanned from deteriorating originals. The man Laurent had labeled possibly FW was standing slightly apart from the other 3, looking at something off-camera. He was lean, not tall, with the posture of someone who spent a lot of time looking at things closely. He was wearing a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and there was something in his hands, a piece of paper or a thin book, impossible to tell. He looked like someone who was in the middle of thinking about something else. Adrian understood this quality. He forwarded the photograph to Deborah with a note. This might be him. 1973. Evelyn came that evening not with the thermos, but with a box of leftover pie from the diner, which she explained was the end-of-day surplus that Ronnie's would otherwise throw out, which was Ronnie's single greatest moral failing in her opinion. It was apple pie, slightly overbaked on the edges in a way that didn't affect the taste. They ate it in the kitchen because it was too cold for the garage without the space heater going, and Mason, who had already had dinner, negotiated a slice with the focused diplomacy of a child who has learned that I already ate dinner is not actually a disqualifying condition. Adrian told Evelyn about the Tennessee lead. She listened with her fork held loosely in one hand, leaning slightly forward in the way she did when she was tracking something carefully. "A bridge consultant," she said. "It's thin," he said. The investigator dismissed it. "But it fits," she said. "He was a structural engineer first. Racing was the detour, not the career." She thought about this. If you wanted to disappear but couldn't stop doing the work, you'd go back to what you knew before the thing that hurt you. Adrian looked at her. "That's a specific kind of observation." She shrugged slightly. "People go back to their foundations when they're in pain," she said. "It's what they know before everything got complicated." She ate a bite of pie. "Is Deborah looking?" "She's finding people who know Tennessee engineering archives," he said. "It's slow." "What else can you do while she looks?" "I've been thinking about the Chicago angle," he said. "The fire at the Caldwell Rice storage facility. The fire is the thing everyone accepted. The reason nobody looked for the car too hard after 1974, but I haven't been able to find a fire report." Evelyn looked up. "No fire report." "I found a reference to the fire in 3 different places: a motorsport newsletter from late '74, Laurent's notes, and the Chicago Racing Federation archive that Deborah pulled the build log from. But none of them cite a specific date or location. Nobody references an actual fire department report." "Could it just be that the records are old and lost?" Evelyn said. "Maybe," Adrian said, "but a commercial storage facility fire in Chicago in 1974 should have a record. The Chicago Fire Department kept records. If the building existed and burned, there's a report somewhere." She was looking at him with an expression he'd come to recognize, the one she wore when she was 2 steps ahead of where he was going. "You think the fire didn't happen," she said. "I think it's possible," he said carefully. "The car wasn't destroyed in the fire, which either means it escaped the fire by coincidence, someone moved it, sold it, it ended up in Houston somehow, or the fire was a story that some people believed, but that wasn't entirely what it claimed to be." "If the fire was a story," Evelyn said slowly, "then someone made it up, or let it be believed." "Yes." "Welder," she said. "It would explain the disappearance," Adrian said. "If you want to vanish, and you want to make sure nobody comes looking for something specific, you tell a story about a fire." He paused. "It would also explain why the car ended up in a salvage yard in Houston rather than destroyed. Someone moved it. Someone who knew what it was decided to hide it instead of destroy it." Mason, who had been eating pie with what appeared to be full concentration, said without looking up, "Why would someone hide a car instead of just driving it?" Adrian and Evelyn both looked at him. "Because it was too valuable to drive, but too important to destroy," Adrian said. "So they put it somewhere it would be safe without being findable." "A salvage yard is a good hiding spot," Mason said thoughtfully. "Nobody looks at broken things." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. "He's right," Evelyn said. "He usually is," Adrian said. He was on the phone with the Chicago Fire Department's Historical Records Division at 9 the next morning, which turned out to be a phone call that required 4 transfers before reaching a person who understood what he was asking for. The person who understood what he was asking for was a woman named Gloria, who had been in the Records Division for 23 years and had the specific competence of someone who knows exactly where everything is in a filing system that nobody else understands. 1974, she said. "Storage facility fire, Chicago area. Do you have an address?" "No address," he said. "I have a business name, Caldwell Rice Motorsports, and a general time frame, sometime in the fall of 1974. "Hold on," Gloria said. He heard the sound of someone who was actually going to look rather than telling him to submit a written request. He waited 4 minutes. "I've got 1974 commercial fires indexed by business type and general area," Gloria said. "Storage facilities." He heard paper. "I don't see a Caldwell Rice. Try just the street or district if you have anything in the motorsport or automotive category," he said. More paper. "I've got a garage fire in Bridgeport in August, a service station on the north side in November. Nothing that matches motorsport storage. She paused. I can do a broader search, but it'll take a few days. I'd need to go through the unindexed 74 logs. Please, he said. I'll leave my number. He hung up. Sat with what he had. No fire report. Which didn't confirm anything yet. Records from 1974 were incomplete. Things got lost. The fire might be indexed differently or in a different jurisdiction. But the absence of the expected record, combined with the car's existence, was starting to form a shape that he was trying not to jump toward before the evidence supported it. He called Laurent. I can't find a fire report, he said. Laurent was quiet for a moment. What does that mean? I don't know yet, Adrian said, but I'm starting to think the fire might have been a way for Welder to disappear the car, and himself at the same time. Make everyone believe the prototype was gone, put it somewhere it would be safe but invisible, and walk away. A long silence on Laurent's end. Why would he do that? Laurent said, and his voice had changed slightly. Not suspicious, but careful. Careful in the way of a man who is recalculating something he thought he understood. I don't know his reasons, Adrian said, but if I'm right, it means the car's survival wasn't an accident. It means he chose to save it and chose to let the world believe it was gone. He paused, which means he might have always intended for someone to find it eventually. He left the authentication plate where only someone really looking would find it. And the build log at the Chicago Racing Federation archive, Laurent said slowly. He contributed material to their archive himself. In 1973, before the fire, I always thought it was routine documentation. A pause. But if you're right, he was leaving a trail. A trail that only someone who already knew what to look for could follow, Adrian said. He wasn't advertising the car's existence. He was leaving the evidence for someone who deserved to find it. The line was quiet for long enough that Adrian checked that the call was still connected. Francis Welder, Laurent said finally, in the tone of a man revising a decades-long understanding of something, may have engineered his own disappearance as carefully as he engineered the car. That's what I think, Adrian said. Which means, Laurent said, that he might have always planned to come back into the story, at some point, under the right circumstances. Another pause. Or he might have died waiting for circumstances that never came. It was the thing Adrian had been trying not to sit with, and it sat with him now, regardless. I'm going to keep looking, he said. Deborah called on Thursday afternoon. I found something, she said, and her voice had the specific quality it had carried in her email when she'd written, "You need to be extremely careful about who you tell." That careful, controlled excitement of someone trying not to get ahead of themselves. Tell me, Adrian said. He was in the garage, which was where he went when he needed to think or when a call required his full attention, and he stood in front of the car the way he often stood in front of it now. Not looking at it exactly, more letting it occupy his peripheral vision while his mind worked on something else. Tennessee, she said. I have a contact at Vanderbilt who specializes in infrastructure history. Bridges, highways, public works, that kind of thing. She knows the Tennessee Department of Transportation archive going back to the 50s. A pause. She found a consulting credit in a bridge reinforcement project in Carter County, Tennessee. 1981. The consultant is listed as F.A. Welder, structural engineer, Rockford Credential. Adrian closed his eyes for a moment. Carter County, he said, northeast corner of the state, rural. The project was a small bridge over a creek on a county road, not a major infrastructure project, which is probably why nobody looked there before. Deborah's voice was controlled, but only barely. The consulting credit is the only record. No address, no contact information for the consultant on file. But it's him, Adrian said. The credential matches, she said. Illinois license number. I cross-referenced it. It's him. A pause. He was in Tennessee in 1981, Adrian, 7 years after he disappeared. He stood in the garage with this information. Outside it had started raining, October doing its final argument for winter, and the sound of it on the garage roof was steady and without drama. Is there any more after 81? He asked. Nothing I've found yet, she said, but my contact is still looking. If you use the credential again, there might be another record somewhere. Thank you, Deborah. Are you going to go look? She said. He hadn't made the decision consciously until she asked. Yes, he said. Carter County is a large area for looking, she said. I know, he said, but it's somewhere. He told Evelyn that night. She had come by after her shift, late, past 10, which had become unremarkable, and was sitting on the kitchen counter because the stools at the kitchen island were occupied by Mason's school projects, which had staged a territorial expansion over the previous week. She listened to the Carter County information and the fire report absence and the whole assembled shape of what he was starting to believe, and when he finished, she sat for a moment with her coffee. You're going to Tennessee, she said. I think so, he said. After the car goes to Santa Fe, that's next week. What are you going to do when you get there? Start in Carter County, he said. Talk to people. The bridge project would have involved local contractors. Someone might remember the consultant. In a rural area in 1981, an outsider working on a local project would have been noticed. He paused. It's a long shot. Most things worth doing are, she said. He looked at her. I don't want to do it alone, he said. I know you have work, and I know it's... When are you going? She said. Mason has a school break in 3 weeks, he said. I'd take him. He's been part of this from the beginning. She smiled at that. He found the car before you did, technically, she said. The point system. He'd want to come, Adrian said. And me? She said, directly and without drama, which was the only way she said things. I'm asking, he said, if you'd come. She looked at him steadily. The kitchen was quiet, Mason asleep, the rain still going outside, the house doing its nighttime sounds. Yes, she said, I'll come. He nodded. Something that had been held in him for a while released slightly at the word. And he noticed this and he thought, yeah, that's what that means. The transport team from Laurent's Santa Fe operation arrived on a Thursday morning with a specialized flatbed and the kind of careful efficiency that expensive things get when expensive people are moving them. They were professional and thorough and handled the car with a respect that Adrian found appropriate. And he helped guide the loading and signed the documentation and watched the flatbed pull out of his driveway with the thing he'd spent 4 weeks with. Mason stood beside him in the driveway. The flatbed reached the end of Sycamore Drive and turned and was gone. It's okay, Mason said, which was the same thing he'd said when Adrian told him about the handshake, offering the assessment with the confidence of someone who had considered all available information and reached a conclusion. Yeah, Adrian said, it is. He put his hand on Mason's shoulder and they stood in the empty driveway for a moment. The garage behind them was noticeably different now, the lift empty, the floor space that the car had occupied clean and bare, the pegboard with its painted outlines, the folding chair with the engineering textbook and Mason's drawings. Roger Pressman was on his front porch across the street, coffee in hand, watching. He raised the cup slightly. Adrian raised a hand. Darlene Hutchins appeared at her front door, looked at the empty driveway, looked at Adrian, and gave a small nod that contained more than a small nod usually carried. The Nguyen kids were on their bikes, stopped at the edge of their driveway, watching with the frank curiosity of children who had not yet learned to disguise interest as something else. It was, Adrian thought, a strange ending and a strange beginning, which was how most things of consequence felt. He went inside and called Laurent. It left this morning, he said. I know, Laurent said. The transport team updates me. They'll be in Santa Fe Saturday. A pause. The museum is already making arrangements for the restoration team. Full restoration, historically accurate, the way Welder would have finished it himself. Another pause. We found something. Adrian felt something shift. What? My research team. They've been working since we signed, Laurent said. They found a record I didn't have. A small racing federation in Tennessee, amateur endurance events, very regional, has a technical advisory credit in their 1984 and 1985 programs. The advisor is listed as F. Welder, no other information. Tennessee, Adrian said. Eastern Tennessee, Laurent said. The federation was based in Kingsport, which is in Sullivan County, Adrian said, adjacent to Carter County. Yes, Laurent said. They were both quiet for a moment with this. He stayed, Adrian said. It appears so, Laurent said. He went to Tennessee and he stayed. A pause. He was advising amateur racers in 1984 and 1985, 10 years after he disappeared, still doing the work. Adrian sat down in the kitchen chair. He thought about Francis Allen Welder, 82 years old, if he was alive. If he was alive. A structural engineer from Rockford who came to racing sideways and built something 40 years ahead of its time and then watched it disappear, or made it disappear, and went to Tennessee and stayed and kept doing the work. I'm going to Tennessee in 3 weeks, Adrian said. I know you said you would, Laurent said. Adrian, he stopped. What? If you find him, Laurent said, and his voice had the quality it had in the garage when his hand rested on the frame rail. If he's there and he's alive, I'd like to come. Adrian understood what that request carried. Decades of it. If I find him, he said, I'll call you before I do anything else. And if he's willing, yes, you should come. Thank you, Laurent said, and the simplicity of it was the whole weight of 20 years of looking. He made Mason's dinner. He helped with homework, or long division, which Mason approached with the same determined logic he applied to the point system and the coat hook mystery, certain that the system made sense if you could just identify the right method. They read their chapter. Mason went to bed. Adrian sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open and Carter County, Tennessee on the screen, a satellite image of a rural county in the northeastern corner of a state he'd never spent more than a few hours in, covered in hills and trees and small roads, and the kind of distance that was good for disappearing into. Frank Welder had been there, might still be there. Evelyn texted at 10:15. Car's gone? Left this morning, he wrote back. How are you? He sat with the question for a moment, which was the correct thing to do with honest questions. Okay, he typed. Then, after a moment, ready for what's next. Her response came back quickly. 3 weeks. 3 weeks, he confirmed. He closed the laptop. He went and stood in the garage doorway for a while, looking at the empty lift and the clean floor and the work light that was off for the first time in 4 weeks. The space heater was off too, and the garage was cold the way garages are cold when nothing is happening in them. He turned the light on for a moment, just to see the space. Then he turned it off and went inside. The drive to Carter County took 11 hours. Adrian had planned for 9, but Mason required 2 unscheduled stops. One for a bathroom emergency outside of Nashville that brooked no negotiation, one because he spotted a roadside stand selling something called genuine Tennessee kettle corn, and made a case for stopping that was so logically structured, Adrian found himself pulling over before he'd consciously decided to. Evelyn was in the passenger seat with her feet up on the dash, which was a habit she'd apparently had for years, and which she'd warned him about before they left Beaumont at 6 in the morning. Mason was in the back with his coloring book, his impossible vehicle drawings, and the serious expression of someone on a mission. It was the first week of November. The hills of northeastern Tennessee were doing the late autumn thing with color, not the peak of it, which had already passed, but the end of it, the burnished remainder of red and orange that hangs on the trees after most of the leaves have gone. The sky was the particular clear gray of a cold day that intended to stay cold. The roads narrowed as they went east, and the towns got smaller, and by the time they crossed into Carter County, the GPS was suggesting routes that followed creeks and wound through gaps and ridges with the casual attitude of a system that had never actually driven these roads. It's pretty, Evelyn said, looking at the hills. Very, Mason said from the back without looking up from his drawing. You're not looking, Evelyn said. I know it's pretty, Mason said. I looked at the beginning. Adrian almost smiled. He had a plan, such as it was. The plan was thin by any professional standard, a county, a name, a time period, and a set of connections that might lead somewhere or might lead nowhere. He'd done more with less in business, but in business the stakes of failing were different. If he found nothing in Carter County, Francis Welder remained a historical figure, an engineer whose name would go on a museum plaque, whose story would be told in the past tense. That was still more than the world had given him, but it wasn't the same as finding the man himself. He had not let himself think too specifically about what finding the man himself would look like. He'd learned over the years that over-imagining an outcome was a reliable way to make the reality of it harder to receive, whatever form it took. They stopped in Elizabethton, the county seat, at a diner that was not Ronnie's, but had the same quality of unambiguous function, a place that served food to people who needed food, without philosophy. Mason had a grilled cheese and evaluated it professionally. Evelyn had coffee and a piece of pie and said the pie was not as good as Ronnie's, which Adrian thought was probably a fair assessment. He had printed everything he had on Welder and brought it in a manila folder: the build log pages, the Tennessee consulting credit, the Kingsport Racing Federation advisory listings from 1984 and 1985. The 2011 investigators' note about the man who had recognized Welder from a photograph on a construction site in 1979 and described him as someone who knew a lot about stress loads. He spread the papers on the diner table after the food and looked at them the way you look at a map when you're trying to orient yourself. The bridge project was Carter County, he said. The Racing Federation was Kingsport, which is Sullivan County, just north. If he was doing both, he was somewhere between them. He looked at the map on his phone. Rural, mountains, the kind of place you go to not be found. The kind of place where people have been here for 3 generations and remember strangers, Evelyn said. Which is either good or bad, depending on whether they liked him, Adrian said. Or whether they knew who he was, she said. Mason was eating his grilled cheese and watching them with the alert attention of a child who understood that something real was happening and was trying to be quiet enough that nobody noticed him. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been refilling coffee for decades, came by and Adrian asked, on an impulse he decided to trust, whether she knew who handled county road maintenance records from the early 80s. She looked at him with the careful neutrality of someone who fielded unusual questions from outsiders with some regularity. County engineer's office keeps old records, she said, but most of the old-timers you'd want is Bill Searcy at the Historical Society. Been here his whole life. Knows everybody who ever fixed a road in this county. The Carter County Historical Society was a converted house on a side street that smelled of old paper and wood oil, and the specific combination that meant serious accumulation over time. Bill Searcy was 78 years old, built like a former farmer, and possessed of the particular alertness that long-term locals develop, the ability to categorize a stranger within 30 seconds and decide how much help to offer. He categorized Adrian, Evelyn, and Mason, and apparently found them acceptable. Bridge project in 1981, he said, when Adrian explained what he was looking for. He said it without hesitation, which meant the project was in accessible memory, not deeply archived. County Road 14, little bridge over Stony Fork Creek. That bridge had been a problem since the 60s, bad original construction. State finally approved a repair. He looked at Adrian. You're looking for the engineer that consulted on it. Yes, Adrian said. Frank, Searcy said. The words sat in the room. Quiet man, Searcy said. Came in from somewhere else. Had an Illinois accent, which was noticeable. Knew bridges better than anyone the county engineer had worked with, is what I heard. He folded his hands on his desk. Stayed after the project. That surprised people. Do you know where he is now? Adrian said. Searcy looked at him carefully. Why are you looking for him? Adrian had prepared an answer for this and then decided somewhere on the drive through the Tennessee hills that the prepared answer was wrong. He told Searcy the real story. The salvage yard, the $100 car, the markings, the build log, the aluminum plate under the dashboard bracket, Victor Laurent and the $5 million and the condition, the Southwest Automotive History Museum and the exhibit that was being planned, Frank Welder's name on the placard. Searcy listened without moving. When Adrian finished, the old man sat for a long time. His hands were still folded. Outside the window, a crow crossed the gray sky. He never talked about any of that, Searcy said. Not to anyone here, far as I know. A pause. I always figured he had something behind him. Man doesn't come to Carter County, Tennessee with an Illinois engineering credential and just stop without having left something behind. He looked at his hands, but he was good to people here, fixed things nobody asked him to fix, helped families with structural problems in their old houses, wouldn't take money for it. He looked up. The kind of man that earns his place in a community by being useful without making noise about it. Adrian thought about an engineer who built something extraordinary and then disappeared and rebuilt himself in a small county in Tennessee, fixing bridges and old houses, still doing the work, just differently. Still being useful. Still applying the thing he understood, how to make structures hold when forces were working against them. Is he still here? Adrian said. Searcy was quiet for a moment. He's still here, he said. He's old. He's had some health trouble in the last year. He paused. He lives about 9 miles east of town, small house on a ridge. His wife died 4 years ago. Local woman, Margaret. Been here since the 70s. He had a wife, he had a life, he had 40 years of a life that nobody outside of Carter County, Tennessee had known about. Can you? Adrian started. I'm not going to give you his address, Cersei said. That's not how this works. He unfolded his hands and placed them flat on the desk. What I will do is call him. Tell him someone has something to tell him. Let him decide whether he wants to hear it. That's fair? Adrian said. It's more than fair, Cersei said. It's the only way I'm doing this. He made Adrian and Evelyn and Mason wait in the small front room while he made the call in his office with the door closed. Mason found a display of historical photographs of Carter County and examined each one with methodical interest. Evelyn stood by the window. Adrian sat in the chair nearest Cersei's door and listened to the sound of a muffled conversation and tried not to construct a narrative around the tone of it before he had actual information. The call lasted 8 minutes. Cersei came out with an expression that gave nothing away. He looked at Adrian. He'll see you, he said. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. He wrote an address on a notepad and tore off the sheet. Don't be late. He's old, but he's exact. They drove 9 miles east the next morning on a road that wound up a ridge through second-growth forest, bare-limbed now and letting the gray sky through in pieces. The house at the end of the drive was small. A story and a half, white-clapboard, old but maintained with the care of someone who understood structural integrity personally. A woodpile under a shed roof. A small workshop visible through bare trees to the side. A truck in the driveway that was at least 20 years old and clean. Adrian sat in the car for a moment after he turned off the engine. Mason, from the back seat. Is he in there? Probably, Adrian said. Are you nervous? Mason asked. A little, Adrian said, which was the honest answer. You don't have to be, Mason said, with the confident simplicity of a 7-year-old who had not yet accumulated enough experience to know when nervousness was appropriate. You're bringing him good news. Evelyn looked at Adrian. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He got out of the car. The man who opened the door was 82 years old and looked like someone who had spent most of those years outside. He was thin. The specific thinness of old age that is different from the thinness of youth. And he stood straight in the doorway in a flannel shirt that was not so different from Adrian's own, which was either coincidence or something more. His hair was white and cut short. His hands, resting on the doorframe, were the hands of someone who had been using them for precision work for 60 years. His eyes were sharp in a way that 82 years had not touched. He looked at Adrian, then at Evelyn, beside him, then at Mason, who was holding his father's hand with both of his, in the serious way he reserved for situations he'd assessed as requiring gravity. Mr. Calloway, the man said. Mr. Welder, Adrian said. Frank Welder looked at him for a moment. Bill told me what you found, he said. Come in. The inside of the house was the inside of a man who had lived carefully and practically for a long time. Bookshelves, a wood stove doing its work in the corner, a drafting table against one wall with something on it. Adrian looked and saw bridge cross-sections, hand-drawn, and felt something move in him that he couldn't have named. Still working, still doing the work, at 82. There were photographs on the mantelpiece above the wood stove. A woman, Margaret, presumably, in several of them, at various ages. A house being built. A bridge, small and rural, that might have been the Stony Fork Creek project. And one photograph, partially hidden behind a larger frame, that Adrian's eye caught and stayed on. It was the Caldwell Rice garage, 1973. The same photograph Laurent had scanned for his files, but the original, clear, full quality. 4 men, the one standing slightly apart, looking at something off camera, with a piece of paper in his hands. Not possibly FW, Frank Welder. Standing in the garage where he'd built the car, 40 years and a whole life ago. Welder saw him looking. Sit down, the old man said. I'll make coffee. He made coffee the way people make coffee when they've been doing it alone for a while, efficiently and without asking preferences. He set 4 cups on the table. He looked at Mason and produced from somewhere a plate of cookies that were clearly store-bought, which Mason received with the diplomacy of someone who understood that the gesture mattered more than the cookie. They sat at the kitchen table. Welder sat across from Adrian and looked at him with those sharp eyes and said, "Tell me," Adrian told him. He told it from the beginning. Bertram's salvage yard, the geometry that was wrong in the right way, the frame markings, the build log in Chicago, the aluminum plate under the dashboard bracket. He told it carefully and in order, and he did not rush it, because this was the story of this man's life's best work, and it deserved to be told at the right pace. Welder sat and listened and did not move and did not speak. When Adrian reached the part about the authentication plate, the 7 characters that confirmed the identity, Welder closed his eyes. It was brief, but Adrian saw it. He told the rest. Laurent, the condition, the Southwest Automotive History Museum, the Public Display Covenant, the Research Fund, the exhibit being built around the car and around Frank Welder and around what the work had meant. When he finished, the kitchen was quiet except for the wood stove. Welder opened his eyes. He looked at his coffee cup for a moment. "I put the plate there," he said, "under the bracket. I did it the last night I worked on the car. I thought—" He stopped. He looked at his hands. "I thought if the car survived whatever was coming, and I didn't know what was coming, I just knew something was coming. I thought someone should be able to prove what it was, where it came from." He paused. "I didn't know if anyone ever would." "Someone did," Adrian said. "You did," Welder said. He looked up. "Why did you look there?" "Because it was the last place anyone would look," Adrian said, which was probably the point. The old man nodded slowly. "The fire," he said. "You figured that out too." "There was no fire report," Adrian said. "No," Welder said. "There wasn't." He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. The team was done. The money was gone. The car was going to be sold for parts or to someone who wouldn't know what they had and wouldn't care. "I couldn't—" He stopped. "I'd spent 18 months on that car. It was the best thing I'd ever done. The best thing I knew how to do." His voice was level, but there was something underneath the level that Adrian could hear clearly. "I couldn't watch it get dismantled for parts. So I moved it. Gave the team a story about a fire, which they were relieved to believe because it meant no difficult questions about assets. Drove the car to Houston, paid a man I knew to store it." He paused. "Paid him through 1980. After that I lost track. I didn't have—" He stopped again. "I'd built a life here by then. Margaret, the community. I'd stopped looking backward." "Yes. The man in Houston eventually sold it," Adrian said. "Probably after you stopped paying. It moved through a few hands before it ended up at the salvage yard." $100, Welder said. $100, Adrian confirmed. The old man was quiet. There was something happening in his face that was hard to look at directly. Not distress exactly, but the thing that happens to a person when 40 years of a held weight shifts position. "Your name is going on the exhibit," Adrian said, not in footnotes. "Frank Welder, engineer. The car, the ideas, the work, all of it attributed to you. The research team is documenting everything that can be found. Any engineering idea that originated with you and appeared in subsequent vehicles is going to be traced back to you." He paused. "The world is going to know who built it." Welder looked at him. "I'm 82 years old," he said. "I've been dead to that world for 40 years. "You've been alive here," Adrian said, "but you should also be alive there. Both things are true." A long silence. "Victor Laurent," Welder said. "I know that name." "He's been looking for the car for 20 years, Adrian said. "He wants to come here, if you're willing." He paused. "He's the one who made sure your name goes on the exhibit. He put it in writing." Welder turned his coffee cup in his hands. He looked at the wood stove, at the fire visible through the glass in the door. He looked at the drafting table with the bridge cross-sections. Then he looked at Mason, who had been sitting with extraordinary stillness for a 7-year-old, eating one of the store-bought cookies with a patience that suggested he understood the weight of the room. "How old are you?" Welder asked him. 7, Mason said. "And 3/4? "Do you know what your father does for work?" Welder asked. Mason thought about this seriously. "He fixes things," he said. "And he finds things. He found your car." Welder looked at Adrian. "Is that accurate?" "More or less," Adrian said. The old man nodded slowly. He looked at Evelyn, who had sat quietly through all of this. present, attentive, not requiring the conversation to include her to justify her being there. "Are you family?" Welder asked her. She didn't hesitate or deflect. "I'm—" she started, and then looked at Adrian, and something passed between them that was not a question and not an answer, but something that contained both. "She's important," Adrian said simply. Evelyn looked at the table, but the beginning of something crossed her face that she didn't entirely suppress. Welder watched this small exchange with the eyes of an old man who had seen enough of life to know what it looked like when something was in the early stages of becoming what it was going to be. "Victor Laurent can come," he said. "Give me a week." Adrian called Laurent from the driveway while Evelyn helped Mason find his coat, which had migrated to somewhere in the back seat with the focused opacity that Mason's belongings always managed. Laurent picked up on the first ring. "I found him," Adrian said. The silence on Laurent's end was not brief. It was the silence of 20 years arriving at a destination. "He's alive," Laurent said. It wasn't a question, but it needed to be said. "He's alive," Adrian confirmed. "He's 82 and he's in Carter County, Tennessee, and he's still drawing bridge cross-sections at his drafting table." Adrian paused. "He'll see you. 1 week." He heard Laurent exhale, one breath, slow and long, the same exhale Adrian had seen him make in the garage on Sycamore Drive when he'd first seen the car. The sound of a man setting down something very heavy. "I'll be there," Laurent said. "Thank you, Adrian." "He put the authentication plate there for someone to find," Adrian said. "I was just the one who looked in the right place." "That's not nothing," Laurent said. "That's everything." They drove back down the ridge road through the bare trees and the gray sky, and Mason announced from the back seat that the visit had scored 480 points in his personal system, which was a new record, eclipsing even the Saturday at Bertram's salvage yard that had started all of this. Adrian asked him to explain the scoring methodology. Mason explained it at length and with full internal logic for most of the drive back to Elizabethton, and Adrian listened, and Evelyn listened, and the Tennessee hills went past the windows in the long amber light of a cold November afternoon. They stayed 2 more days. Not for the investigation, that was done, but because Carter County, Tennessee turned out to have a quality that made leaving feel abrupt. They hiked a ridge trail with Mason between them on Saturday, the 3 of them in the bare woods with the wind and the cold and the views that opened up where the trees ended and showed you how large the hills were and how small everything else became in relation to them. Mason found a creek and conducted experiments with rocks and water that appeared to have a theoretical framework. Evelyn walked beside Adrian on the trail, and their hands found each other at some point without either of them making a decision about it, and they both left it at that without comment, which was the right thing to do with something that didn't need to be named yet. On Sunday afternoon, before they drove back to Beaumont, Adrian knocked on Frank Welder's door one more time, alone. Mason and Evelyn were at a diner in town. Welder opened the door and looked at him and stepped aside without speaking. They sat at the kitchen table again. No ceremony, just 2 men with coffee. "I've been thinking about something," Adrian said. "Since I left on Friday." Welder waited. "You built something that changed how engineers think about a problem," Adrian said. "Your ideas are in championship-winning cars. Your name isn't on any of them because nobody knew you'd had the ideas first." He paused. "When the exhibit opens and the research is published, that changes. The engineering community will know." He stopped again. "But there are also kids. Kids who want to be engineers, who don't have resources, who need to see that the path isn't always straight and the recognition doesn't always come when it should, but the work is still worth doing." He looked at Welder. "I'm starting a foundation. In my wife's name, she died 2 years ago. Scholarship fund, support for families who are trying." He paused. "I'd like to add a component specifically for engineering students, and I'd like to attach your name to it. Not instead of hers, alongside." Welder was quiet. "Why?" he said. "Because your story is actually about the work," Adrian said. "Not the fame, not the money, the work. You built the best thing you knew how to build, and you protected it when you couldn't protect anything else. You rebuilt your life around being useful in a different way when the first way was gone." He paused. "That's what I want students to see. That the work matters even when the world isn't watching." The old man looked at his hands for a long time. "Margaret would have said yes immediately," he said. She had no patience for hesitation. "What do you say?" Adrian asked. A pause. "I say yes," Welder said, "with one condition." "What?" "The Foundation helps people who are trying," Welder said. "Not people who have it figured out, the ones who are still in the middle of it, still making mistakes and still going." He looked at Adrian. "Those are the ones worth investing in." "Agreed," Adrian said. They shook hands across the kitchen table. Welder's grip was still firm, the grip of a man who had been doing precision work for 60 years and whose hands still knew how to hold something correctly. The drive back to Beaumont was quieter than the drive out. Mason fell asleep somewhere in Alabama, which was the right place to fall asleep on a long drive. Evelyn had her feet on the dash and was reading something on her phone, and the miles went past in the comfortable silence of people who don't need to fill the space between them. Adrian drove and thought about things. He thought about a $100 car and what it had been hiding, and about how many things in his life he'd walked past without stopping, and about the specific quality of attention that changes what you see. Not special vision, not genius, just the willingness to crouch down and look carefully at something that everyone else has dismissed and ask what it actually is rather than what it appears to be. He thought about Rachel, not with the bracing quality, not with the weight, just with the simple, factual love that had become how he mostly thought about her now, 2 years and some change of practice later. She would have been good at all of this. She would have liked Evelyn's directness and Frank Welder's precision and Mason's point system and the way the Tennessee hills looked in November light. She would have had opinions about all of it. He was glad she had existed. He was glad she had given him Mason, who was asleep in the back seat, with one arm hanging off the seat in the specific graceless way of total unconscious commitment. He was glad that the grief had not, despite its best efforts, made him into someone who stopped looking at things carefully. He thought about Evelyn, about the red thermos and the coffee and the overturned bucket in the garage and the conversation about what you won't give up before you sit down, about her hand in his on the ridge trail, unremarked on, exactly right. He thought about Frank Welder at 82 in his white clapboard house on the ridge, still drawing bridge cross-sections, still doing the work, still alive in a county that knew him as a man who fixed things and didn't make noise about it. The world about to find him again, the exhibit in Santa Fe going up with his name on the placard. Victor Laurent coming in a week to sit at that kitchen table. The work survives. That was the thing. You can hide a car for 40 years and the work is still in it. You can lose a person for 40 years and the work they did is still in the world. It doesn't require anyone's permission to be true. It just is. 4 months later, on a Saturday morning in March, Adrian drove to Santa Fe with Mason and Evelyn. The Southwest Automotive History Museum was not a grand building. It was a converted warehouse on the edge of the city, honest in its architecture, which Adrian appreciated. The parking lot was full when they arrived, which the museum director had warned him about. The exhibit opening had drawn more than the local audience. Automotive journalists, engineering historians, several people who had been on the vintage motorsport forum thread that had started everything. Deborah Shanks was there, wearing the expression of someone who felt appropriately guilty and appropriately redeemed simultaneously. Laurent's team was there. Laurent himself was there, standing near the entrance with Frank Welder beside him. Welder had made the trip from Tennessee. He was thin and upright in a dark jacket that was clearly not his usual style. Someone had probably suggested the jacket. And he was looking at the front of the building with an expression Adrian couldn't read from the parking lot. Mason spotted him and said, "That's the man from the house," and broke into the half-run that was his standard transition speed, pulling ahead of Adrian and Evelyn, and arrived at Welder's side and looked up at him. "You came," Mason said. "I came," Welder said. "Are you nervous?" Mason asked. Welder looked down at him. Something moved in the old man's face. "A little," he said. "You don't have to be," Mason said. "It's your car." Laurent looked at Mason with the expression of a man encountering something unexpected and finding it more valuable than what he'd expected. They went inside together, so Welder and Laurent, Adrian and Evelyn and Mason, Deborah Shanks, the museum director, the crowd of people who had come from various distances to see this thing. The exhibit was in the main hall. The car occupied the center of it, under lights that showed the restoration work. Completed, historically accurate, the damage corrected but every original element preserved. It looked like what it was, a vehicle from 1973, hand-built, perfect in the way things are perfect when made by someone who understood the problem they were solving at a level most people never reach. The placard beside it was exactly what Adrian had required. Frank Welder's name at the top, full size, not footnote. Below it, the story, the career, the prototype, the engineering ideas, the influence on subsequent racing design. A timeline showing where Welder's innovations appeared in later championship vehicles. A separate panel for the full documentation of the build log and authentication evidence. Adrian watched Welder walk toward the car. He watched the old man stop in front of it. He watched the 82-year-old hands come up and then stop, hovering near the bodywork without touching, the way Laurent's hand had hovered before landing on the frame rail in the garage on Sycamore Drive. Then Welder touched the car. His hand rested on the front fender for a moment, and Adrian looked away because some things are private even in public spaces, and a man seeing his life's best work after 40 years was one of them. Mason was holding Adrian's hand without having made a decision about it. Just the hand finding the other hand, the way it did in situations that required it. Adrian held on. Evelyn stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. She had her arms crossed against the March cool of the museum, and she was looking at the car and the old man and the crowd of people who had come to see what had been found, and her face had the expression it wore when something landed fully. Not performed emotion, just the real version, quiet and specific. "Hey," she said softly, not looking at him. "Hey," he said. "You did a good thing," she said. "We did," he said. "It took a while." "Most good things do," she said. He looked at the car, at the placard with Frank Welder's name in full size at the top, at Welder's hand on the fender, at Laurent standing nearby with the expression of a man who has finally set down something he has been carrying for 20 years. He thought about Bertram's salvage yard, the crow complaining about something, the October morning, Mason cataloging the world by color and assigning it points, the wreck shoved against the back fence under the shell of a dead Chevy pickup. He thought about what Mason had said on the porch at Frank Welder's house. "You're bringing him good news." The thing was, that was true about most of it, about most of what had happened in the last 4 months. The car was good news, the condition was good news, the research fund was good news. The Scholarship Foundation, the Rachel Calloway Foundation, with Frank Welder's name alongside hers for the engineering component, was good news, and the applications had already started coming in, and he'd spent 2 evenings the previous week reading them with Evelyn at his kitchen table. The two of them, with their coffee, going through the files of people who were in the middle of things and still going. It was all, at its root, the same thing. The willingness to stop, to crouch down, to ask what something actually is rather than accepting what it appears to be. The world had walked past that car for 40 years. It had walked past Frank Welder for 40 years. It had its reasons. The fire story, the rust, the damage, the general human tendency to take the assessment of the first observer and save time. Most things that appear broken stay broken, in most people's experience. The math is against expecting otherwise. But some things are just waiting. Waiting for someone patient enough to look twice. Waiting for someone with enough stillness in them to hear what the thing is actually saying under the noise of what everyone else has decided it is. Adrian had been lucky. He'd had the background and the training and the Sycamore Drive garage and the particular mood of a Saturday morning in October when you go to a salvage yard, because it's the kind of thing you do when you need to be somewhere that requires all of you. He'd also been paying a specific kind of attention that had nothing to do with credentials and everything to do with having had enough stripped away that he'd stopped assuming he knew what things were before he looked at them. Grief does that to you if you let it. Not gracefully, not on any kind of schedule. But eventually, if you keep showing up and keep looking carefully, it teaches you something about what's actually worth your attention. He was still learning. He expected to keep learning for a long time. Mason tugged his hand. "Dad?" "Yeah." "Can we go look at the car closer?" "Yeah," he said. "Let's go look." The three of them walked across the museum floor toward the car, toward Frank Welder standing beside it with his hand still resting on the fender, toward Victor Laurent and Deborah Shanks, and the crowd of people who had come to see what had been found in a salvage yard for $100 on a Saturday morning in October. Behind them, somewhere in the museum, a child was asking their parent what the car was. Adrian could hear the parent struggling to explain it. The history, the significance, the story of the engineer who built it and disappeared and came back. The parent was getting some of it wrong. That was fine. That was how stories spread. Imperfectly, person to person, losing some things and gaining others, finding their way to people who needed them through routes nobody planned. The car sat under the lights. Frank Welder looked at Adrian as he approached and said, in the tone of a man who had decided something, "The plate, under the bracket. I want it noted in the documentation exactly where you found it." "Already in there," Adrian said. Welder nodded. "Good," he said. "People should know where to look." Mason stepped up beside the old man and looked at the car with his full, serious attention. The same expression he'd worn in the salvage yard, the same expression he wore when evaluating grilled cheese, the same expression he brought to everything he'd decided deserved his complete consideration. 480 points, he said solemnly. Welder looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means it's really good," Mason said. The old man looked at the car, at his name on the placard, at the people who had come from various distances to stand in the presence of something that had been found after a very long time. "Yes," Frank Welder said. "I suppose it is." Adrian stood in the museum with the people he'd arrived with and thought about a $100 wreck that had become this. Not because of the money, not because of the condition, not even because of the $5 million handshake in a Beaumont garage, while 11 neighbors watched from across the street and didn't know what they were seeing. But because one morning, in a salvage yard that smelled of rust and old rubber, and something organic and difficult to name, a man had crouched down and looked carefully at something everyone else had walked past, and seen something underneath.